The foundry door was torn from its hinges on the third morning after the head count. Saito stood by the furnace with a pair of tongs in his hand. The ingot in the fire had just turned white hot. He didn't have time to pull it out. The first of the intruders splashed a bucket of water into the furnace. Steam hit the low ceiling and billowed back down. The strip of metal turned black in the blink of an eye. 6 hours of work were now worth nothing more than scrap. There were 4 of them. 3 held oak sticks. The 4th held a book. He held the book with both hands as one would hold a child. On the copper tier, that book was worth more than any person in that room. The man with the book introduced himself as a collector from Meizan's office. He didn't ask who the foreman was. He asked where Saito was. Foreman Hassan stepped out from the corner and pointed to the furnace. He pointed with his finger. He didn't say a word. In 31 years of work, Hassan had never said a single unnecessary word, and he wasn't about to start today. The collector opened the book to the bookmark. The bookmark had been inserted beforehand. That meant the book had been opened before he left the office. That meant everything had already been decided without him. Saito set his tongs down on the anvil and straightened up. The collector began to read. Line 42. Tier, copper, foundry. Name, Saito. Age, 21 years. Caste according to the census, ashes. Trade, blacksmithing. No right to an independent forge. Inherited debt, 6,400 sparks. Maturity date, 41 days. The workshop fell very quiet. The apprentices at the second forge stopped pumping the bellows. Saito heard water dripping from the ceiling into the flooded forge. He asked the collector to repeat the last 2 lines. The collector repeated them word for word with the same expression. Inherited debt, 6,400 sparks. Saito said he had no debts. The collector replied that he did now. He explained this just as matter-of-factly as he had read it. 3 weeks ago, a debtor named Toju died in the lower barn. Toju owed the office 6,400 sparks, secured by a tool. Toju had no heirs. According to the code, an unpaid debt passes to the person listed in the next line of the same workshop's registry. Saito was listed on the next line. The collector closed the book and added that no one here was to blame for anything. That's how the system works. Saito stared at the closed book. He wasn't thinking about the debt. He was thinking about his own line. At the centerpiece, he had stood on the threshold scales for 118 heartbeats. He remembered every single one of them. He remembered how the pan beneath his feet had dropped and hadn't stopped at the first mark. He remembered the scribe Ujen's face. Ujen wasn't looking at the scales. Ujen was looking at the door. Then, Ujen leaned over the register and wrote for longer than he had for everyone else. At the time, Saito had assumed the scribe was simply writing out a long word. Now he realized the scribe had been writing a different word. He told the collector there was a mistake in the register. The collector replied that the register was never wrong. He said it was the people reading it who were mistaken. Then he nodded to his men, and the work began. 3 men with sticks walked along the wall and began taking down the tools. They didn't take just anything. They took only what was marked. Someone had been here before them and marked with chalk the items that were worth money. Pliers, 3 hammers, crimping pliers, mandrels, a nail set. They carried each item to the door and loaded it into a wheelbarrow. Saito looked at Master Hassan. Hassan looked at the floor. He was 62 years old and had run this forge longer than Saito had been alive. He could have said one sentence. He could have said that the boy had been working for him for 6 years and had never taken anything that didn't belong to him. Hassan said nothing. He picked up a charred glove from the floor and hung it on a nail. Saito remembered that gesture. He would later recall it more often than anything else from that morning. The wheelbarrow was rolled out into the yard. The foundry yard was paved with slag and glistened like black glass in the rain. It hadn't rained for 4 days. The slag was gray and dry. People were already standing in the yard, not because they'd been called, because news of the collectors travels faster than the collectors themselves. The apprentices were standing there. 2 women from the dye shop across the way were standing there. The water foreman was standing there. They had all seen Sato every day for the past 6 years. Today they looked at him differently. Not with malice, worse, with cautious interest. That's how you look at someone who is no longer part of your circle. The collector placed the wheelbarrow in the middle of the courtyard and began counting aloud. He named each item and its price. Pliers, 9 sparks. Blacksmith's hammer, 4 sparks. Crimping tool, 11 sparks. The total came to 206 sparks. The collector said that this was 1/6 of 1% of the debt. He said it without mockery. He simply stated the number. The number was worse than any mockery. Then Sato spoke aloud for the first time. He said that the scales had shown him not ashes. The courtyard heard him. The courtyard didn't believe him. The watermaster was the first to look away. The women from the dye house exchanged glances. One of the apprentices laughed briefly and immediately stopped himself. The collector didn't even get angry. He said that such words carried a fine of 30 sparks and that he wouldn't record them out of respect for the morning. Then Rinhar entered through the gate. He didn't come in through the side gate like everyone else in the workshop did. He entered through the large gate that was opened for carts. Rinhar was 20. He had grown up in this very courtyard. For 6 years, he and Sato had slept in the same shed by the cooling stove. In the census, Rinhar received an obsidian, a blade gift granting direct admission to the Well of Steps, the second obsidian on the copper tier in 9 years. Now, Rinhar wore a gray cloak with a trimmed collar and walked through the main gate. He walked straight up to the wheelbarrow. He looked at the tool. Then he looked at Sato and said that all of this was utter nonsense. He said he'd already spoken with the office and asked for a postponement. He said he was ready to contribute the first 500 sparks from his own supply. The courtyard let out a collective sigh of relief. Someone spoke his name with warm respect. Rinhar raised his hand and asked them not to praise him for the obvious. He said they'd grown up together, and he wouldn't abandon a man at a time like this. Sato listened and did the math. 500 sparks out of 6,400. 1/13. A 4-day extension at the office rate. Rinhar wasn't saving him. Rinhar was buying himself a courtyard for 1/13 of someone else's debt. Sato said he didn't need help. He said it matter-of-factly. The courtyard exhaled again, this time differently. The woman from the dye house told her neighbor that pride comes before a fall. The apprentices nodded. In the space of 5 words, Sato lost what little he still had left in the courtyard. Rinhar lowered his hand and put on the expression of a man who'd been struck in the back. He said he understood everything and that the offer still stood. He asked the collector to go easy on him. Then he took 2 steps back and turned so that the courtyard could see his profile. Sato was standing closest to him. He was the only one who could see his entire face. Rinhar was looking at the tool cart, and the corner of his mouth was turned up. He wasn't gloating. He was checking the tally. That's how a man looks when he's added up the column and made sure the total checks out. At that moment, Sato realized 2 things. First, the entry in the ledger had not been altered by accident. Second, whoever had altered it would never speak to him. The collector took out the receipt and handed it to him along with the stylus. Sato signed his name. The letters came out even. His hand didn't tremble. The collector looked at the signature longer than necessary. He was used to something different. In 7 years of service, he'd collected from 23 households. 21 people screamed. 2 fell to their knees. 1 set his own shed on fire that very night. No one signed with neat letters. The collector asked why he was so calm. Sato replied that screaming wouldn't reduce the amount. The collector grunted and tucked the receipt into his shirt front. He said that within 41 days, Sato must pay 6,400 sparks or enter the circle of debt and work off the debt with his body. He said the second option was faster. He said those who chose the second option lived shorter lives. Then he stated the final condition. The ash caste has no right to an independent forge. That means Sato cannot take custom orders. That means he cannot earn a living through his craft. He can only haul slag, 7 sparks a day. 7 sparks a day. 6,400 sparks. 914 days. 41 days left on his sentence. The collector didn't bother to voice this calculation. He was sure the boy would figure it out himself. The boy did figure it out himself. The wheelbarrow was wheeled out through the gate. The crowd began to disperse. People left quickly, without looking back. Master Hassan was the last to leave. He paused nearby for 3 heartbeats. He said the furnace wouldn't cool down until evening, and that Sato could sit inside until then. That was all he could offer. Sato nodded. Hassan left. Sato remained alone in the middle of the courtyard. He didn't go inside. He stood there, dissecting what had happened piece by piece, just as one would dissect a failed forging. The debt had moved down to the next line in the register, so it mattered who was listed on the next line. On the census, he was 38th in line. He remembered this exactly because he had counted the heads ahead of him, 38th. But in the book, he was listed as the 42nd entry. Between 38th and 42nd were 4 people. 4 people who had been entered before him even though they were standing behind him. Someone had moved him down 4 lines, exactly enough so that he ended up below the dead Toju. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate, subtle, and cheap. It cost the scribe 8 extra strokes of the stylus. It cost Sato everything. He turned toward the gate and saw that there was one more person in the courtyard. Oban was standing by the wall under the awning. He stood under the awning until the lantern above the gate went out on its own. The workshop allocated exactly 12 hours worth of lamp oil, and no one topped it off beyond the quota. When it grew dark, Sato left the courtyard and headed downhill. The copper level lay 3 streets down the slope of the mine. Further down, the stairs to Ashrow began. He descended, counting the steps out of habit. 212, the same as always. The world around him hadn't changed by a single step. Only a line in the book had changed. There were no streetlights in the ashrow. There, slag dust was burned in flat bowls, and a sweetish smell of smoke hung in the air. Sato rented a corner from a widow named Meisu for 1 spark a day. The corner was behind a curtain in the common room. 4 people were already living in the room. No one asked his name. In Ashrow, they only ask for a name from those who can pay for more than a week. In the morning, he went to the Porog pawn shop. The pawn shop stood on the copper tier right next to the office square and was the only place where a person of the lowest caste could legally view their own line. Viewing it cost 4 sparks. Sato had 9. He paid. The clerk brought out the list and placed it on the counter with the convex glass facing up. Sato read slowly. Line 42. Everything was just as the collector had read it. He asked to see line 38. The clerk replied that other people's lines were shown only by decision of the collegium. Sato asked how much such a decision would cost. The attendant replied that the petition cost 200 sparks and required a witness who had been present at the census and was willing to confirm the order of the queue on record. 200 sparks and Oban. Sato thanked him and left. In the square, he sat down on the edge of a water fountain and laid everything out to calculate the cost. 200 sparks for the petition, 6,400 in debt, 40 days to pay it off, 7 sparks a day for carrying slag. Any honest path hit a wall at the second line of the ledger. So there was no honest path. So he needed another one. He knew as much about the Well of Steps as every child on the level did. The well had opened 109 years ago in an old salt mine and hadn't closed to this day. 71 levels down. Entry is allowed once every 9 days. Each level passed raises one's recording cast by 1 step, regardless of what the scales showed. A slag grain drops from every creature killed. The office accepts the grains and pays in sparks. 11 sparks are given for a grain from the first level, 60 for a grain from the 5th. Sato didn't know the price beyond that because no one had gone beyond the 5th tier of the copper tier in 4 years. And there was one main rule that everyone knew. You can only descend once. If you fail, the entrance closes forever. Your failure is recorded, and you remain in the caste you started in until you die. 11 sparks per grain, a debt of 6,400, 582 grains from the first tier, over 4 runs, 145 grains per run. The man with the hammer kills 8 on the first tier. Sato set this calculation aside, not because it was wrong, but because it was the only one. At noon, a man from the office found him. Not a collector, someone else, thin with ink-stained fingers. He said the office wouldn't wait 41 days with its hands folded. He said the debtor was obligated to work off the debt starting on the first day, and he said that confiscated property had already been assigned to the debtor. Sato asked what that meant. The man explained. Toju's property had been seized for the debt. Everything worth even a spark was sold that very day. What remained was what no one had bought. According to the regulations, unsold confiscated property is transferred to the heir of the debt along with the location where it lies. Not as a gift, as an obligation. The heir is obligated to keep this property intact until the debt is fully repaid. If the property is lost, the debt will be increased by its appraised value. Sato asked how much it had been appraised at. The man looked at the paper and said, 2 sparks. The location turned out to be a basement beneath a burned-down saltworks on the edge of Ash Row. The door hung by a single hinge. Inside, it smelled of old smoke and wet stone. The man with ink-stained fingers didn't go down. He handed over the key and left. Sato went down alone. In the basement stood a forge, a small one, made of brick, with a broken chimney. The bellows were torn in 2 places. Next to it lay an anvil weighing 1.5 poods with a chipped horn. A hammer lay on the anvil. Sato picked it up before he realized what he was doing. The hammer fit in his palm like no other hammer in Hassan's workshop ever had. The head was a third heavier than usual. The handle was shorter. The balance shifted forward by a finger's width. It was impossible to work with a hammer like this for long. But with a hammer like this, one could strike with great precision. There was a brand on the side of the head. The brand had been worn down to a smooth spot. Not chipped, not chiseled off, worn away. Just as one would wipe an inscription off wax with the palm of one's hand. Sato turned the head toward the light and held it there until his eyes watered. The brand had been worn away from the inside. The metal around the spot was intact. He sat down on the floor next to the anvil and stayed there until dark. He wasn't thinking about his debt. He was thinking about the fact that a man named Toju had lived 2 streets away from him for 6 years, and he had never once heard of him. A blacksmith with his own forge on Ash Row. That's impossible. The Ash caste has no right to its own forge. So Toju wasn't an Ash. That meant he, too, had been reclassified downward. And he died in the lower shed 3 weeks before his debt was carried over to the next line. Sato stood up and began repairing the bellows. He worked on them for 4 hours using scraps of leather he'd found in the corner. By midnight, the bellows were holding air. He poked a hole in the chimney from below with a crowbar and cleared it out by hand. He had coal, 1.5 handfuls in his pocket from his last day in the workshop. He lit the fire and waited for the masonry to heat up. The fire at the bottom of the cellar burned steadily. It didn't flicker or waver. Only a properly built furnace burns like that. Whoever built this furnace knew more than Hassan did. In the morning, Sato took 30 copper scraps and went to the 3rd outpost on Ash Row. There, they accepted small jobs without requiring a furnace permit. Payment was made off the books, and everyone knew it. He took an order for 40 staples for the supports, 1/4 of a spark per staple, 10 sparks for 2 days' work. He made the staples and thought. He thought about what talent looked like, not as a word in a registry, but as a thing. Rinhar has a gift for blades. Rinhar takes any blade in his hand and strikes exactly where he looks. The gift isn't in the blade. The gift is in Rinhar. Everyone knows this. Everyone is certain of it. Sato finished the last bracket by evening on the 2nd day and carried them to the outpost. On the way, he passed a drainage ditch by the lower wall. Something was stirring in the ditch. He stopped. An ash rat. Not an ordinary one. One of those that come up through the cracks in the well when it gets too crowded down there. The size of a dog. Bare skin covered in gray growths. A rat like that was worth 9 sparks if you turned it into the office whole. Sato took a hammer with a worn-away brand from his belt. He had never killed anyone. He stepped forward and struck it once, from top to bottom. The rat twitched and went still. A pea-sized slag grain rolled out from beneath it. Dull gray, warm. He'd seen grains like this hundreds of times at the office's receiving desk. He picked it up and rolled it between his fingers. Then he did something he didn't expect of himself. He didn't take the grain to the receiving area. He took it to the basement. Later, he thought back on that evening many times and couldn't explain why. The closest explanation was this: he simply didn't feel like going to the office. In the basement, he stoked the furnace. By dawn, he had a knife and a single thought. He began to test that thought right then and there. Sato gripped the knife by the handle and stepped out of the basement onto the empty street. The Ash Row was asleep before the shift change. He closed his eyes and stood there. At first, there was nothing but his own breathing. Then his hearing turned inward. He heard water in a pipe under the pavement 12 paces to his left. He heard a mouse scraping against the wall in the house across the street. He heard footsteps on the upper staircase around the corner and, from the sound, realized that a person was carrying something heavy in his right hand. All of this was underground and behind a stone. All of this could be heard as clearly as if the walls didn't exist. He opened his eyes and shifted the knife to his left hand. His hearing remained. He set the knife on the ground and took 2 steps back. His hearing vanished instantly. He picked up the knife. His hearing returned. Saito repeated this 11 times in a row. On the 11th try, he sat down right on the pavement and laughed. It was the first time he'd laughed in 6 days, and the sound of his laughter felt foreign. After that, he worked like a blacksmith, without enthusiasm, just testing. He caught a second rat around noon in the same ditch and embedded its grain into the strip in 5 different ways. The first conclusion came easily. The grain only enters the metal on the first strike against the white part. The cooled metal does not accept the grain. It simply bursts. The second conclusion cost him 2 days and half a piece of coal. Only one grain fits into a single groove. A second grain will never fit into the same groove, no matter how many times you strike it. This property applies to only one blade. If you want the second property, forge a second blade. The third conclusion was the most important and the most unpleasant. The property works only as long as the blade is in your hand. Let go of it, and it's gone. That means you have to carry your arsenal on your person. That means weight and space are everything. The fourth conclusion came on its own on the third day. Above each finished blade was a line, and on that line was the word frame, followed by a number. 12, 9, 15. He struck the finished blades with the heel of his hammer and counted the blows until a crack appeared. The number always matched. Frame refers to how many blows a weapon can withstand before the property disappears along with the metal. Poor forging wielded 9. Good forging yielded 15. That meant his own craftsmanship came into play directly. That meant everything the silent Hassan had taught him over the past 6 years was now worth more than any cast. By the fourth day, Saito had 4 knives. The hearing of an underground rat. 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 The rats in the ditch were all the same, and their attributes turned out to be the same. He looked at the 4 identical knives and realized the following without any hint. The value of the arsenal equals the value of the one he killed. A rat grants hearing. Someone else will provide something else. That means other creatures are needed. That means the well is needed. The entrance would open in 2 days. He spent those days preparing and used up all 9 sparks. 3 went toward coal, 4 toward scrap iron from dismantling the old support structure, 2 toward rope. He stopped eating on the second day and didn't even notice it on the third. He hadn't forged a weapon for himself. He had forged 6 blanks. 6 strips brought to the point of the final strike and then stopped. Each could be finished in 12 strikes if he had a fire at hand. There would be no fire down there. He took with him a portable brazier he'd assembled from a bucket and the grate of a burned-out furnace. It weighed 8 pounds and was the heaviest item in his bag. Any other person would have laughed at a blacksmith who climbed into the well with a bucket of coals instead of a sword. Saito walked down with a single knife on his belt and the bucket on his back. On the day of the descent, everyone gathered at the entrance to the well on the copper level. It was the main spectacle of the 9 days. A reception desk stood at the mouth of the well. Clerks from the collegium stood there. Onlookers stood in 3 rows. Families stood there. Saito was the last to join the line, and they recognized him within a minute. A murmur went through the crowd. Then laughter. Not malicious, cheerful. Someone asked aloud if Ashes was planning to repair the staircase down there. Someone else replied that he was carrying lunch to the 7-tiered toad. Saito looked straight ahead and said nothing. The same collector with the book was sitting at the reception desk. He looked up and stared for a very long time at the bucket behind Saito. Then he asked if the debtor understood that the descent could only be made once. Saito replied that he understood. The collector asked why he needed a brazier. Saito replied that it was cold down there. The collector made a note and let him through. The descent wasn't down a staircase. It was a funnel made of compressed salt, and a person walked down it for a quarter of an hour until the light from above turned into a white dot. The first level of the well looked like a flooded warehouse. A low ceiling, salt drippings on the walls, water up to his ankles, and a silence so thick you could hear your own blood pulsing. Sato knew the rule for the first level by heart. 18 salt slugs, a creature the size of a calf, standing on 4 short legs with a shell of encrusted salt. The shell can withstand an axe blow. It can only be killed through the lower seam. The crawler strikes with its head and breaks ribs. The estimated time to clear the level is 4 hours. A typical group of 5 people clears the first level in 3 hours and loses 1 member. Sato was alone and had a kitchen knife. He removed the bucket and fanned the coals with a bull's bladder. Then he sat down against the wall and closed his eyes. The knife, with a rat's sense of hearing, lay in his palm. His hearing swept downward and to the sides. He heard 18 sources of sound. He heard the salt crunching beneath their armor. He heard that 4 of them were standing still, not moving at all. He heard where the water was deeper by the sound of falling drops. He did not go to the center. He went into the narrow passage between 2 overhangs where only 1 crawler could fit at a time. He waited there for 40 minutes. The first crawler entered the passage, and Sato struck it with a hammer, its brand worn away from the bottom up into the lower seam. The hammer passed through. The crawler fell. A grain the size of a plum rolled out from under its shell, dull blue. Sato took a blank from the sack. He placed it on the coals and held it there for 60 heartbeats. The metal turned white hot. He laid it on a flat stone. He placed the grain beneath the strip. He struck it. The grain vanished. He finished forging the strip with 12 blows and submerged it in water up to the ankle. Steam rose to the ceiling. He raised the blade and read the line. Frame 14, removed property. Salt crawler's armor. He took the blade in his left hand and struck his forearm with the hammer's butt at half strength. There was no impact, just a dull shock wave, and that was it. His skin didn't turn red. He struck with full force. Same result. He stood ankle-deep in salt water on the first level of the well of steps, holding in his hands an object that didn't exist in this world. The remaining 17 crawlers took him 2 hours and 11 minutes. He didn't hide. He walked down the center of the passageway with the knife of hearing on his belt and the armor blade in his left hand. The crawlers struck him with their heads. He didn't back away. He struck upward along the seam. Once, then again. By the end, his right arm wouldn't rise above his shoulder. The armor blade's health bar dropped from 14 to 3. He made it. He put 18 grains into the bag. He emerged through the funnel and saw a white speck of light that grew for a quarter of an hour. A crowd was still gathered at the mouth of the shaft. Usually, the first groups emerged after 3 hours, and the crowd waited for them. Sato emerged after 2 hours and 40 minutes. He was the first to emerge. He emerged alone. He emerged with a bucket on his back. A hush fell over the receiving area. The collector stood up. He was a man who, in 7 years of service, had seen 23 courtyards and had never once been surprised. He approached on his own, something he never did. He asked to see the bag. Sato poured 18 grains onto the reception scales. The college clerk leaned over the scales and counted them aloud. 18. A full pass through the first tier. All by himself. Casto Pepel. The collector remained silent. Then he asked what weapon had been used. Sato showed him a hammer with a worn-away mark. The collector took it in his hands and turned it over. An ordinary blacksmith's hammer with a heavy head. He handed it back and looked Sato in the face very intently. He said that the debtor had paid off 198 sparks of debt in a single day. He said this loudly so that the whole square could hear. And Sato realized that the collector wasn't doing this out of kindness. The collector was adjusting his own records. The man who had laughed at the bucket yesterday was now proclaiming his feat today. It's easier that way than explaining why you laughed. The crowd began to murmur. Someone shouted that it was rigged. Someone else replied that the test couldn't be rigged because the grains couldn't be faked. A man in a gray cloak with a trimmed collar stepped out of the third row. Rinhar had come to the descent just as all the obsidians did. He walked up to the scales and looked at the 18 grains. Then he turned to Sato, his face warm and open. He said he was glad and that he'd always known that perseverance was more important than caste. He said he was ready to take Sato into his group on the second tier. He held out his hand. The square fell silent at this gesture. An obsidian was extending his hand to Pepel. People would be talking about this for 9 days. Sato looked at the outstretched hand. He didn't offer his own. He said he didn't have time. He set aside the thought of people not because it was frightening. He set it aside because it was premature. He lacked the frame. The blade of the armor withstood 14 strikes and crumbled. Against a person with a gift for the blade, 14 strikes amount to 6 seconds. So, first comes the craft, then everything else. For the next 9 days, Sato lived in the basement and went out only to get coal. He took the issue of the frame apart piece by piece, just as one would dismantle a failed forging. He figured out 3 things, and each one cost him a batch of scrap metal. First, the frame grows from the purity of the metal. Scrap from dismantled fasteners yielded a 9. Scrap iron from the third outpost yielded a 15. So good metal is needed, and good metal costs sparks. Second, the frame grows from the number of forges. A strip folded in half and reforged yielded 2 more. Folded in 4, it yielded 2 more. It didn't increase any further, so the limit for his hands was around 20. Third, and most costly, the frame fails if the grain enters the metal off-center relative to the strip. He lost 4 grains before he learned to place them blindly under the white strip with half-finger precision. He practiced this on cold pebbles 100 times a day until his hands stopped missing entirely. This was his routine. He'd get up before dawn and work until the coal ran out. Then he'd go to the third outpost and take a small order for staples and hinges to buy coal for the next day. Then he'd return and work again. He slept 4 hours. He ate once a day. In 9 days, he lost so much weight that his shirt hung off his shoulders like it was on a stick. In 9 days, he forged 21 blanks, 19 of which were frames. Mrs. Mays, the widow from whom he'd rented a corner room for the first week, told her neighbors that the tenant wasn't a tenant at all. He was a ghost. On the 8th day, she brought him a bowl of boiled chaff down to the basement. She set it on the anvil and left without saying a word. Sato finished everything and washed the bowl. He later returned the bowl to her a year and a half later, and she didn't recognize him. On the 9th day, he went down for the second time. The second level of the well was dry. The floor there was made of compressed salt, polished to a shine. The vault rose 20 meters upward and disappeared from view. Salt whips dwelled there, eyeless creatures 4 paces long, resembling flat ropes. The whips hung from the vault and fell upon their prey from above. The speed of the fall was such that a person didn't have time to look up. A group of 5 people took 5 hours to pass through the second level and lost 2 members. Sato took his knife of hearing and a brazier with him. He entered and immediately closed his eyes. His hearing turned upward. He heard them all. 29 whips on the vaulted ceiling. He heard them breathing through their skin. He heard that, a quarter of a heartbeat before striking, the whip would come to a complete standstill. That was all the information he needed. He made his way through the second level in 3 hours and 40 minutes, standing still and without raising his head. He listened. A quarter of a heartbeat before it struck, he took half a step to the side. The whip struck the salt floor and remained flattened for a quarter of a heartbeat. He struck the knot beneath his head with a hammer, 29 times. Of the 29 grains, he forged one into the workpiece right there on the spot. Frame 19. Property removed. The salt whips fall. He took the blade in his hand and tried to take a step. The world blurred. He found himself at the opposite wall without realizing how. He tried again, more slowly, and realized that the property didn't grant running speed. It granted a single burst of 4 steps in any direction. 1, then a cooldown of 30 heartbeats. He went upstairs with 29 grains and 2 blades at his belt. They were waiting for him at the entrance. Not a crowd. The crowd would gather around 4 o'clock. A collector with a book was waiting, and standing next to him was a man Sato was seeing for the first time. A fat man, in a fine cloak, with a ring on his thumb. The collector introduced him without naming him. He said the man was a representative of the firm. The fat man looked at the grains and named a new price. He said the firm was revising its acceptance standards and, starting that day, second-tier grain would be priced at 11 sparks instead of 26. Sato asked on what grounds. The fat man replied that it was due to an excess of supply. He said this while looking him straight in the eye and not hiding his smile. An excess of supply. 29 grains from one person in 9 days. Sato counted aloud. He said that at that rate, his debt would be paid off in 111 days, but he only had 26 days left. The fat man spread his hands and said that was unfortunate. Then he added the reason he had come. He said that Mason's office was ready to buy out the entire debt right away, today, in exchange for an 8-year contract of personal service. A blacksmith of such talent would be useful to the firm. Sato's own free will was not provided for in the contract. Sato looked at him and understood something very simple. It wasn't greed. It was a goal. No one cuts the price in half out of greed. They cut the price so the person won't be able to pay it off. He refused. The fat man nodded the way people do when they hear what they expected and left. The collector remained. He recorded the acceptance at the new price and then said one sentence quietly, without looking up from his book. He said that the order regarding the price had not come from the office. He said it had come from the council, signed by the clerk. Then he slammed the book shut and left as well. Ujen. Sato was walking downstairs, folding up a painting. The clerk had moved his line. The clerk had lowered the price of grain. The clerk was either getting something in return for this or was afraid of someone. The clerk was the first stone in the masonry, but he wasn't the one building it. That evening, a guest came to see him in the basement. Oban. He descended the broken staircase sideways and stopped at the door. He didn't come in. He said his daughter was feeling better. He said the medicine had helped. He said he now owed the office 400 sparks. Sato waited. Oban finally got to the point. He said the pen had been dipped 11 times. He said that for a single line, the pen is dipped 3 times. He said that the scribe Ujen wrote 3 lines in a row in the register without lifting his head, and that he later covered the first 2 with his palm and erased them with the edge of a knife. He said he saw this from 3 paces away. He said he wouldn't testify. He said he had a daughter. Sato said he wasn't asking him to testify. He asked for something else. He asked him to recall who was standing behind the scribe. Oban was silent for a long time. Then he said that behind the scribe stood a man in a gray cloak with a trimmed collar. He said the man had approached the table after the scales had been shown and stood there while Ujen wrote. He said he hadn't seen the man's face. He was lying. He had seen the man's face. He simply didn't want to say the name out loud in the basement where someone might hear him. Sato didn't press him. He thanked him, and Oban left almost running, as he always did. Sato sat down by the brazier and stayed there half the night. 2 blades hung from his belt, the armor and the rush. In his pouch lay 46 grains, each containing 11 sparks. 6,004 sparks of debt. 26 days. And now he had the name of the man who had been standing behind the scribe. He took a blank blade and placed it on the coals. He forged until dawn, not because he needed a blade. He forged to keep his hands busy while his mind did the math. By morning, he had done the math. There was no way, under any circumstances, to pay off the debt honestly. That meant he needed to take the dishonest route. There was only one dishonest route in Ash Row, and it was called the Circle of Debt. The Circle of Debt gathered in the old water pump house at the lower edge of the tier. There, debtors worked off other people's debts with their bodies in full view of the public. The public placed bets in sparks. The office took a third. The rule was simple, and Sato had learned it from the widow Meisu, who knew everything in the row. The stakes don't rise for a win. The stakes rose for refusing to give up. Every minute a person remained on their feet after being allowed to lie down was worth a certain number of sparks. 12 sparks were paid per minute, 200 for 10 minutes. People died in the circle not because they were killed. People died because the price of staying on their feet rose faster than the price of life. Sato arrived there on the 25th day of his term. At the entrance stood an administrator named Tegu, writing down the names of those who wished to enter in a notebook. He looked at Sato and didn't even bother to open the notebook. He'd been preparing for exactly 24 hours, and he hadn't spent that time training for battle. He'd spent it calculating everything that could go wrong. The armor blade could withstand 19 strikes. That meant that after the 19th, he'd become an ordinary man with his collarbones exposed. That meant his defense had a limit, and that limit was close at hand. He forged 3 identical armor blades from 3 grains of the crawler and hung them all on his belt. 57 strikes. He calculated that this would last 4 minutes. 4 minutes cost 48 sparks. That wasn't nearly enough for anything. He forged a 4th and a 5th. Then he looked at his belt with the 5 identical blades and realized he was doing the work of a pack mule. That was when, for the first time, he thought about something he hadn't considered before. He couldn't carry his entire arsenal. That meant he had to choose his arsenal based on the task at hand. That meant before every job, he had to know what to expect. That meant the listening knife was more important than anything else, and he must never remove it from his belt. He had never broken that rule once in his entire life. In the evening, the water tower was packed to the brim. Inside stood a vat made of riveted iron, 12 paces in diameter, with a torn-off lid. A ladder led down into the vat. The ladder was removed. Upstairs, people stood in 4 rows in a circle, looking down. Light came from 6 bowls of burning dust, and down below, it was as stifling as a furnace. Saito went down first. His opponent's name was Jaro, and he was a loader at the salt warehouse. He was a head taller and 1.5 times as broad. He owed the office 300 sparks for his mother's funeral. Tegu announced the rules from above. They were to stand until one of them refused to stand. For every minute after the first, both would be paid. Jaro called down from above that he didn't want to maim the boy and that he should lie down right away. Sato replied that he wouldn't lie down. For the first minute, Jaro hit him with half his strength. He struck his shoulders and torso, and the blows bounced off the armor's blade like a wall. Jaro stopped and looked at his fists. The crowd roared. In the second minute, Jaro began to strike in earnest. Sato didn't retaliate. He stood there and counted the blows. 18. 19. The first blade cracked in its sheath with the sound of shattering ice. The 20th blow landed squarely on him, and he realized what a salt warehouse laborer's fist felt like. He fell to one knee. The crowd roared. Tegu, up above, began counting to 10. Sato got back up on the count of 4 and shifted his hand to the second blade. Then the work began. He stood. Jaro struck. Every 19 blows, another blade snapped, and Sato would fall to one knee and get back up. He got back up 11 times. At the 7-minute mark, Jaro stopped striking and simply stood there, breathing heavily with his arms hanging down. He called down that he wouldn't continue. He said this wasn't a fight, but a slaughter, and that the cattle here wasn't a boy. Tegu declared the match over at the 8-minute mark. 84 sparks for Sato, 84 for Jaro. In 8 minutes, Sato earned as much as he did in 12 days hauling slag, and he lost 5 blades and 5 grains. He climbed the stairs on his own. The crowd was silent as he walked. Then one person clapped their hands, and within 3 heartbeats, the whole water pump house was clapping. Jaro found him outside by the water tap. He sat down next to him on the edge and was silent for a long time. Then he said he'd hit him 190 times and hadn't budged him an inch. He said that in 9 years in the circle, he'd never seen anything like it, and that he didn't understand how it worked. Sato told the truth. He said it wasn't him. It was the steel. Jaro looked at the 5 cracked blades in his hands. Then he took his own knife from his belt and laid it down beside them. He said he no longer needed the knife because he was leaving the circle. He said that after today, he wouldn't be able to continue. He left, and Sato remained on his knees with a stranger's knife. He entered the circle 4 more times over the next 9 days. The pattern was always the same. He stood, the others struck. The blades cracked. He got back up. Tegu counted the minutes and recorded the sparks. On his 3rd time in, he stood for 14 minutes against 2 opponents at once. On the 4th outing, he stood for 19 minutes and walked out of the vat on his own 2 feet, his left arm, which hadn't moved for 3 days, still by his side. The water pump grew more crowded with each session. By the 5th outing, people were standing in the street, listening through the wall. They gave him a nickname, even though he had introduced himself by name. They called him the One Who Stands Up. Someone brought that nickname to the copper tier, and it made its way up the stairs. Over 5 runs, he collected 1,412 sparks. Together with the grains and the payment, his debt dropped to 3,180. 17 days remained. For the first time, the numbers added up. He checked 3 times and got the same result each time. If he kept up this pace, he'd pay off his debt in 14 days with 3 days to spare. That night, he slept for 6 straight hours for the first time in a month. The problem came from where he least expected it. It didn't come from the office. It came from fame. On his 6th bout, Tegu pitted him against a man who had been brought in from the silver tier. Tegu said the request had come from above and that he couldn't refuse because the office had paid for it. The man's name was Haran. He was an overseer of the Craftsman's Guild, Silver Caste, Gift of Pressure. He wasn't a circle fighter and had no debts. He arrived at the water pump house in a clean cloak and descended into the vat without taking it off. Sato realized what was happening even before the first strike. He knew it from the way Haran looked up at the audience before beginning. He was checking to see if the view was clear. Haran struck the first time, and the armor's blade cracked from a single blow. The gift of pressure didn't strike the body, it struck the object. The second strike shattered the second blade, the third. In the space of 9 heartbeats, Sato was left standing in the middle of the ring with nothing but his belt, facing a man who knew exactly what needed to be broken. He knew its properties. That meant someone had told him. That meant someone had been watching his belt very closely for a very long time. Sato snatched the blade from its sheath and stepped 4 paces to the side. Haran turned calmly and waited for the recoil. He knew about the recoil, too. Then Sato did the only thing left for him to do. He stopped defending himself. He stepped forward with the hammer bearing the erased mark and took 3 consecutive blows of the gift. The first broke 2 of his ribs. The second tore his ear. He took the third blow on his forearm, and his forearm snapped. He had reached his target. He struck with the hammer in a bottom-to-top motion, just as he would when fighting salt crawlers. Haran fell face down into the vat and did not get up again. The water pump exploded. Tegu shouted from above for someone to bring a ladder. Sato stood over the body of the workshop guild overseer with a broken arm, realizing what had just happened. Haran wasn't breathing. A grain rolled out from under his cloak, small, black, with a matte surface. A grain falls out of a dead man. He knew this in theory. Now it lay at his feet. He picked it up before anyone from upstairs had a chance to come down. He hid it in his sleeve. The ladder was handed down a minute later. 2 minutes later, guards from the copper tier entered the water pump house. There were 9 of them, and they walked with too much confidence for people who'd been summoned on short notice. They'd arrived before the news could reach them. They'd been summoned before the fight. The senior guard announced to everyone that a debtor from the Ash caste named Sato was accused of murdering Haran, the overseer of the workshop guild. Tegu shouted that the fight was legal and paid for, and that the request was in the notebook. The senior guard replied that the notebook had been seized an hour ago for inspection. An hour ago, before the fight. Sato stood with a broken arm, listening as everything he had built up over 30 days crumbled. He looked up at the ring of faces above the pit. In the 4th row, right against the wall, stood a man in a gray cloak with a trimmed collar. Rinhar wasn't smiling. Rinhar simply looked down, and his face bore the same expression he'd had when he'd looked at the tool cart that first morning. He was checking the tally. The numbers added up. From there, Sato acted without thinking. He drew his blade with his right hand and took 4 steps to the side, right up against the wall of the vat. The guard rushed toward the ladder. He thrust the blade into a crack in the riveted seam that he'd noticed on the very first evening, a seam held together by 8 rivets. He struck it with the hammer. The seam gave way. Water from the upper pipe of the water pump gushed into the vat and knocked the guard off his feet. The men with lanterns walked in silence, and that was worse than their shouts. Sato pressed himself against the mouth of a drainage ditch and didn't move. The knife of hearing lay in his right palm. His left arm hung at his side, and he tried not to think about it. He turned his knife of hearing upward and counted. 22 people. They weren't moving in a chain. They were moving in a grid. One would stay in place while 2 others circled the house from both sides. That's not how you search for a fugitive. That's how you comb through an area. He heard one of them tap the shutter with a stick, and the shutter opened from the inside. He heard a woman's voice. The voice called his name and said that the tenant had left that very evening. Meisu lied calmly and convincingly. She was 54 years old and had been lying to the authorities her whole life. Sato remembered that, too. He crawled down the ditch toward the lower wall. The ditch led into an old spillway, and the spillway opened into the mine shaft. He crawled on his knees and right elbow, and every jolt reverberated through his broken ribs. After 100 steps, he stopped counting. After 300, he lost track of which way was up. It was pitch black in the spillway, and his hearing worked better than his sight. He could hear water ahead. He was heading toward the water. By dawn, he crawled out of the pipe at the bottom of the old mine shaft, 3 versts from Popelny Row. The first thing he did once he was above ground was lie on his back and stay there for an hour. He wasn't sleeping, he was counting what he had left. A hammer with a worn-away mark, the knife of hearing, the blade of the tear from Skeleton 19, the knife Jaro had given him, 11 sparks, a black grain in his sleeve. That was all. He'd lost the cellar with the mountain. He'd realized this back in the vat when he'd heard the words about the confiscated notebook. Whoever had summoned the guards an hour before the fight was already sitting in his cellar by morning. He checked anyway. He returned to the saltworks at dusk the next day and lay down behind a collapsed wall 40 paces away. He took the knife of hearing and listened. There were 4 of them in the cellar. They weren't talking, they were just sitting there. He heard one of them shifting something made of iron and realized they were sorting through his blanks. 21 blanks with the skeleton, 19. 9 days' work. He lay behind the wall for an hour, watching the gap in the door. Then he crawled back. He pulled the brazier out from under a pile of slag by the outer wall. He always hid it there because lugging a bucket of coals across the entire row was pointless. It was intact. That was his entire haul for the evening. Now he had to decide where to go, and decide quickly. There was no way up. On the copper level, they knew him by sight, and he was accused of murdering the foreman of the workshop guild. There was only one path left, and it led down and to the side. The salt rift. He'd heard about the rift since childhood, the way people hear about a place no one goes. Old mines, mined to the bottom 4 generations ago. The Threshold Council had struck them from the register of levels because it was cheaper to strike them off than to maintain them. There were no castes, no guilds, and no guards there. Those who had been struck off the registry along with the mines lived there. Everyone knew 3 things about the rift. The office doesn't go there, they don't issue rations from there, and there's no water there. He walked there for 3 days. On the first day, he walked through the lower workings, holding onto the wall with his right hand. The second day began with him being unable to get up right away. He lay there for another half hour, coaxing his body. He ate the salt mold that grew on the damp vaults. It made him queasy, but kept him on his feet. As the second day drew to a close, a salt cart caught up with him, and the driver let him walk alongside for 2 sparks. The driver talked about prices the whole way, and Sato didn't answer once. On the third day, the tunnel began to widen, the ceiling rose higher, and he saw the fault. It was a crack in the rock 200 paces wide and so deep that the bottom was invisible. The walls of the crack were riddled with adits on 7 levels. Fires burned in the tunnels. Footbridges made from old mine supports spanned the fissure. 8,000 people lived there, and no one had ever counted them. The cart driver dropped him off at the upper footbridge and told him one useful thing. He said that the first thing they ask a stranger here isn't their name. The first thing they ask here is how he pays for water. The fault had no water of its own. All the water was hoisted from the lower horizon by a single hoist, and the hoist belonged to a man named Weiran. Weiran did not call himself the leader and held no official position. He simply controlled the water. A daily ration of water cost 3 sparks. A person without water could survive in the salt rock for 4 days, but on the 5th day, they would stop getting up. Sato paid 9 sparks for 3 days in advance and was left with nothing. He sat down on a ledge at the second level and realized that he was 21 years old, his arm was broken, and he would die here in 3 days if he didn't come up with a plan. He had to come up with a plan while lying down. He took out his listening knife and began to listen to the rift. He listened for 6 hours straight and mapped it out in his head. He heard where the water was flowing and where it was being stolen through a crack on the 4th level. He heard where they were chipping away at the rock and where they were sleeping. And he heard what he was looking for down below, beneath the living levels. He heard the creatures. The Stitchers lived in the rift. He didn't know their name back then and came up with it himself later. A creature a step and a half long, without eyes or a shell, resembling a gray sack with 4 jointed legs. The Stitcher fed on carrion, and no one bothered it for one reason. The Stitcher could not be killed. A severed leg would regrow in a minute. A Stitcher cut in half would crawl back together in a quarter of an hour. The people of the rift simply gave the lower horizon a wide berth, and that was that. Saito went down there on the second day with a single Jaro knife in his right hand. He wasn't going to kill it. He was going to watch. He watched for 4 hours. He figured out that the Stitcher regrew everything except one thing. It had a knot beneath its front pair of legs where all its nerves converged. The knot didn't regrow. The Stitcher simply never exposed it. It walked with its belly pressed against the rock. On the third day, Saito cornered one in a narrow crevice where it couldn't press itself against the rock and stabbed it from below. The creature curled up into a ball and went still. A seed rolled out from under it, a murky white, the size of a walnut. He held it in his palm and realized it was the most valuable thing he'd ever held in his hands, and that there was nowhere to smelt it. There was no furnace. He climbed up to the 4th level and began building a furnace. The first thing he did was beg the water thief on the 4th level for clay in exchange for 2 measures of his own water. He was left with just 1 measure for 2 days. Second, he hauled salt blocks from the dump one by one with his right hand. He did this for 4 days, and each block weighed 30 pounds. Third, he laid the masonry with one hand and reworked it 3 times because it was settling. Fourth, he traded a bull's bladder for Jaro's knife. He gave up his only spare blade for it and didn't regret it for a minute. During those days, he didn't utter 10 words in the rift. People from the 4th level watched as the one-armed stranger hauled blocks and built something resembling a furnace out of them, and no one helped him. By the 6th day, people started placing bets on him. They bet on how much longer he'd last. Most bets were on 4 days. The elevator supervisor on the 4th level was an old man who'd been stationed there for 19 years. He'd seen everything in the rift and was surprised by nothing. On the 7th day, he went down to the masonry himself and stood looking at it for a long time. Then he said that the masonry wasn't laid the way they do it here. He said that's how they do it in the upper workshops, and that he hadn't seen anything like it since he was young. He asked who had taught him. Saito replied that a silent man had taught him, and that he'd been taught for 6 years. The old man grunted and left. An hour later, he returned and brought half a sack of coal. He said he wasn't giving it to him, but exchanging it, and that the exchange would take place once the furnace was up and running. He didn't say what for. The furnace started up on the 8th day. Saito stoked it with one hand, holding the bellows with his foot pressed against his knee. The fire burned steadily and didn't flicker. He placed a strip hammered from old mine timbers into it and held it for 60 heartbeats. The metal turned white hot. He laid it on a flat stone. He placed the forger's grain beneath the strip with his right hand, without looking, just as he'd practiced 100 times a day. He struck. The grain disappeared. He forged with one hand for 19 strikes instead of 12 because the blows were coming out weaker. He quenched the strip in the remaining water and used up all his water doing so until morning. He raised the blade, and a line appeared above it. Frame 17. Property removed. Binder fusion. He took the blade in his right hand. Nothing happened. He sat there with it and waited. After a minute, his left hand began to itch from the inside, right where the crack was. 10 minutes later, the itching turned into pain. Half an hour later, the pain became so intense that he lay down on the floor and clenched the edge of his sleeve between his teeth to keep from screaming. He lay there until morning. The healing process was not gentle. It was like forging. It broke apart what had healed incorrectly and set it anew. By dawn, he was able to bend his elbow. By noon, he raised his arm above his shoulder. His ribs were back in place by evening. His ear remained torn because the blade fused bone and tendon and didn't consider the ear important. He found out the cost that same evening. His skeleton dropped from 17 to 11. The blade didn't expend itself on blows. It expended itself on time. Every hour in his hand cost 1 frame point. Sato did the math and concluded that his entire broken arm had cost him 6 hours of carrying it. He sat down and wrote this down with charcoal on the wall. He had written the rules on the basement wall before and continued doing so here. Rule 11. Fusion is spent on time, not blows. On the 9th day, he emerged onto the 4th level with a healthy left arm. The first person to see him was the water thief from whom he'd taken clay. At first, the water thief didn't recognize him. Then he did, and sat down right where he'd been standing. He said he'd seen that arm 8 days ago, and that it had been hanging like a rope. He said bones don't heal that way. Sato replied that they do if you set them properly. An hour later, the entire 4th level knew about it. 2 days later, the whole rift knew. Bets on his death had to be refunded, and in the rift, this was considered a major event. The old man from the lift came to get me on the 10th day. He brought with him a woman who hadn't been able to straighten up since the cave-in 3 years earlier. He left. Refusal would have cost him water, and he realized this even before the condition was stated. Before leaving, he took the hearing knife from his belt and set it on the anvil. Then he thought better of it and hung it back up. The rule he'd established on his first day in the circle allowed for no exceptions. He never took off the hearing knife. Wiran lived on the 7th level in a former accounting house for spearmen. The house was the only building in the rift constructed of hewn stone. Inside, it was dry and smelled not of salt, but of wood. On the table stood a basin of water, and that basin was simply sitting there. In the rift, it was like a bonfire of banknotes. Wiran turned out to be a man of about 60, with the hands of a former miner. He didn't stand up to greet him. He pointed to a bench, and Sato sat down. The conversation lasted 40 minutes, and Sato later dissected it piece by piece many times. Wiran didn't start with threats. He started with a tally. He said that for 18 days in the rift, those who were supposed to die had stopped dying. He named 4 people. He said that each of these 4 now owed the foreign blacksmith more than they owed water. He said that power in the pit rests on one thing. It rests on the fact that everyone needs the same thing, all in one place. He said that the blacksmith had created a second water and hadn't asked for permission. Sato replied that he hadn't taken a single measure. Wiran said it wasn't about the measures. It was about who a person turns to when they're in trouble. Then he asked directly. He asked where the property came from. Sato was silent for 6 heartbeats. He could have lied. He could have mentioned rare ore or an inheritance. Instead, he did what he later called his first real wager. He placed the blade of fusion and the blade of tear on the table and named both properties aloud. He said that he extracts talent from the dead and forges it into metal. He said that the property only worked when held in the hand. He spoke of the skeleton. He left one thing unsaid. He didn't say that the seed could also be extracted from a human. Wei Ran listened without interrupting. Then he took the blade of tearing and took a step. He found himself standing by the wall. He placed the blade back on the table very carefully, just as one would set down a full glass. He said that up above, they'd grant guild membership for something like this. Sato replied that up above, they'd require 8 years of personal service for something like this, and he'd already refused. Wei Ran laughed for the first time during the conversation. Then he laid out the terms. The blacksmith stays in the rift. The blacksmith pays the water a quarter share. The blacksmith treats whoever Wei Ran designates in the order Wei Ran specifies. In return, water is provided free of charge, and no one in the pit will touch his tunnel. Sato agreed to the first and second conditions. He hesitated at the third. He said he would set his own order. He said those who can't stand up go first. Wei Ran looked at him for a long time. Then he said that the boy didn't understand how the pits worked. Sato replied that he did understand. He said that the person who decides who recovers becomes the leader of the pit after a year. He said he didn't want to become the leader of the pit. He said he wanted to leave this place. It was that last sentence that convinced Wei Ran. He agreed. He said that it's easier to keep a person who wants to leave than one who wants to stay. Work in the rift went on as usual and lasted 16 days. Sato later described those days in 4 scenes. First, a line stretching along the entire 4th level leading to the adit, and he comes out and says, "There are 3 blades today and 9 hours. Figure it out among yourselves from here on." Second, the lower horizon, and he, alone among the welders, herds them into the crevices, 8 at a time per shift. Third, the dump, where he cuts the support into strips and folds the metal into quarters to raise the frame to 19. Fourth, night, and he sits by the cooling forge with Haran's black grain in his palm. He had tried to forge the black grain twice. Both times, the workpiece cracked on the first blow. It wasn't the strip that cracked. It was the anvil beneath it. He realized this the second time. The grain of a man demanded a different frame. Not 19. Much more. He didn't know how much more. He wrapped the seed in a rag and put it away. News of him reached the upper realm on the 9th day, and it didn't come through the people of Wei Ran. It came through that woman who had straightened up. Her brother lived in the upper tier. 6 days later, a man descended into the rift and began walking through the levels, asking questions. They figured him out within an hour. In the rift, a stranger stands out like a torch. They brought him to Wei Ran, and Wei Ran sent for Sato. The man turned out to be a collector for Mazen's office. The very one. The one with the book. He had neither the book nor an escort, and he looked terrible. He spoke while standing and did not sit down. He said he had not come on official business. He said he had come because he himself was being kicked out of the office. Then he explained the reason for his dissent. The request for a fight with Overseer Haran had been paid for by Mazen's office. The payment was recorded in the receipt book, and the receipt book bears the collector's handwritten mark. Tegu's ledger was seized and destroyed. They were unable to seize the receipt book because receipt books are submitted to the college every 9 days, and the book had been sent upstairs the day before the fight. This means there is a record that the fight was paid for and legal. This means the murder charge is worthless. And this means the man whose hand made the mark becomes superfluous. The collector said that in 2 weeks he had been transferred 4 times and had been accused of forgery once. He said he had realized one simple thing. He said that if the boy were found guilty of murder, the mark in his book would become the mark of an accomplice. He said he hadn't come to save the blacksmith. He had come to save his own record. Sato listened and thought that this was the first honest man he'd met in 2 months. Weiran asked the only question that mattered. He asked who had paid the agency for the request. The collector replied that the request had been processed through a debt contract and that the contract had been signed personally by Mason. He said that Mason doesn't sign off on trivial matters. That meant Mason had been ordered to do it. That meant there was someone higher up than Mason. He said he didn't know who. He was half lying. He knew the general direction. He said that the order regarding the grain price had come from the collegium, signed by a clerk, and that clerks don't sign such documents without the magistrate's permission. The magistrate of the Parag Collegium. The 5th step on the ladder that Sato hadn't yet built in his mind. Then came 10 days of proceedings, and Sato later said that those 10 days had worn him out more than the circle had. He took almost no part in them. He sat in the rift and forged, while upstairs, paperwork shuffled through paperwork. The registry was retrieved from the college's archives. The entry was found. The application for the fight turned out to be paid for and legitimate. The charge of murdering Warden Haran fell apart not because anyone had proven his innocence. It fell apart because 2 pieces of paperwork didn't match up. The system that had struck him from the cast also struck the charge against him, and did so with the same indifference. Sato realized then something that stayed with him until the very end. The order wasn't evil. The order was blind. Evil were the hands that reached into it. On the 29th day, 3 people arrived at the rift, and this time they came openly. 2 women and a man. All 3 wore gray work jackets with a black square sewn onto the shoulder. The Anvil Academy. The eldest was named Kana. She was nearing 50 and was missing 3 fingers on her left hand. She went down to his tunnel on her own and didn't wait for him to be brought to her. She entered and, first of all, didn't look at him. She looked at the furnace's masonry. She walked around it and touched the vaulted ceiling. Then she asked who had laid it. He replied that he had laid it himself. She asked under whose tutelage. He named Hassan. She said she had known him 40 years ago and that he had been the best on the copper tier and that he had been killed in someone else's furnace for keeping silent. Then she sat down on a log and explained why she had come. The Anvil Academy wasn't a school for fighters. The academy manufactured equipment for the well and supported the entire upper tier with that. The academy had heard about a blacksmith who could imbue metal with properties, and the academy wanted that method. Kana didn't try to hide it. She said outright that she'd been sent to buy him or poach him, and that she'd try the latter. Then she named her price. The academy would settle his debt of 3,180 sparks that very day. The academy would remove his ash caste and register him as an apprentice, granting him the right to operate his own forge. The academy would protect him from Mason's office with all its might. In return, he would work for the academy for 9 years. Everything he forges during those 9 years belongs to the academy, and he must reveal the technique to his mentors without holding anything back. Sato asked what would happen to the technique afterward. Kaina didn't lie. She said the technique would be incorporated into standard equipment and that in a year, every group descending into the well would receive a blade with that property. She said it would save hundreds of lives a year. She said the academy would earn so much from this that the amount was incalculable. He asked if the method would be his. She replied that it wouldn't. He was silent for a long time. He wasn't thinking about the 9 years. He was thinking about the fact that, for the first time in 2 months, he was being offered a way out, and a real one, not a trap. And about the fact that the price of that way out was giving up the only thing he had. He said he'd give his answer in the morning. He emerged from the rift via the same upper walkway he had entered 47 days earlier. Behind him lay the mine shaft with the miner and the line of people dispersing in silence. The old man from the lift had accompanied him all the way to the top without saying a word the entire way. At the exit, he handed Sato a bag containing 11 binder seeds that the people of the 4th level had gathered for him over 2 nights. He said it wasn't a gift, but a trade, and that the trade would take place when the blacksmith returned. He didn't say why he would return. The Anvil Academy stood on the silver tier and occupied the entire southern slope. Sato saw it from above at the last bend in the road and stopped. He thought he knew what a large forge looked like. He didn't. 22 forges under a single roof, 200 paces long. 4 water-powered lifting hammers. A separate hardening yard with 4 barrels as tall as a man. An iron warehouse where strips of metal were stacked to the ceiling. Everything he'd fought for over the past 2 weeks in the rift, bit by bit, lay here, and no one cared. Kaina led him across the yard, and along the way he stopped 3 times without even realizing it. She didn't rush him. Later she said she'd seen that look on the face of everyone who came up from below, and that it would pass in a month. He was assigned to the 4th work crew. A work crew wasn't a team. A work crew was a shift of 4 people working one horn. The first person he met was Tyrone. Tyrone was 24, and on the copper tier, he was the person Saito had failed to become. Copper caste, the gift of a steady hand. He'd entered the academy through the standard track 9 years ago, and in those 9 years had risen to the rank of senior apprentice. He looked at the newcomer to the artel, and the first thing he said was that he didn't understand what merits the new guy had to be shoved into the shift as a man struck from the registry. He didn't say it behind his back. He said it to his face, and Saito appreciated that. The other 2 had different names, and in all their time there, they'd never said anything of substance. Work in the workshop was organized as follows. For 8 days, they forged the tools. On the 9th day, they descended into the well to test what they'd forged. The academy held the exclusive right to descend to the first 5 levels at any time, and that was its primary privilege. For the first 8 days, Saito remained silent and worked. He applied the frame to whatever came to hand and didn't explain to anyone why his shift's blanks turned out harder. Tyrin noticed on the 3rd day. He took a strip from Saito's hand, tested it for flexibility, and examined the fracture. He said that folding it in 4 like that was done only on expensive equipment, and that they didn't fold it that way for reinforcement because it took twice as long. Saito replied that longer, here and where he'd worked before, meant different things. On the 5th day, Tyreen stopped setting his strips aside separately. On the 7th, he asked how Saito sensed when the metal was ready. Saito replied that he didn't feel it. He said he counted his heartbeats. 60. Tyreen left and returned an hour later, saying he'd counted and it really was 60. He said he'd been doing it by eye for 9 years. He was the first skeptic Saito had convinced at the academy, and he hadn't done it by force. He didn't tell anyone about the method except Kaina. Kaina knew everything and kept it to herself. She would come to his forge every other day, sit on a log, and watch. She would ask one question and then leave. On the 3rd visit, she asked if the carcass would drop from repeated tempering. He replied that he didn't know. She told him to check. He checked, and the carcass dropped by 2. He wrote this on the wall as the 13th rule. She came 8 more times, and after each of her questions, a line appeared on the wall. He realized later that she wasn't trying to pry the method out of him. She was teaching him to explore his own craft systematically, not haphazardly. That was more valuable than anything the academy had given him. On the 9th day, the guild descended into the well. Saito was entering the well for the 4th time in his life, and the first time not alone. It turned out to be worse than solitude. The third level was a gallery with a ceiling 6 steps high and walls of pure salt. Salt boars inhabited it, creatures weighing 15 poods with a protrusion on their foreheads. The boar would charge in a straight line and crush a man along with his armor. The quota for the team was 2 hours and 14 boars. The team worked like this. 2 men held the gallery with their shields, one struck from the side, one provided backup and rotated positions. Over 9 years, the strategy had been honed down to the last detail. Sato stepped into the formation, and the formation fell apart in the 4th minute. He didn't step back when the boar charged at him. He stood with his armor blade and took the impact to the chest, sending the boar flying backward. Tyron, with his shield, stepped aside as they'd been taught and found himself in the open. The other 2 didn't know where to strike because the target wasn't moving. By the 7th minute, the boar had reached the man on the far end of the team and broken his hip. They called off the descent. Back up top, Tyron said that the newcomer charged like a battering ram and that the squad wasn't a battering ram. He said that in 9 years, no one had ever broken formation. He said this loudly in front of everyone, and Sato didn't say a word. He went to the forge and worked until morning. In the morning, he went to Kaina and told her he was leaving the squad. Kaina listened and replied with a single sentence. She said he was thinking about the wrong thing. She said the team had been built for people who die from a single blow. She said you can't fit a person who doesn't die into that system and that a new system needs to be built. She said that's what he'd be working on for the next 9 years. Then she added something that turned his world upside down. She said that he still considered his property to be a form of protection. She said it wasn't protection. She said it was a place. She said that a person who cannot be moved is placed where needed so that no one can pass. He returned to the collective, and they reworked the system for 11 days. He later described this in 4 scenes. First, the academy courtyard at night, with 4 people moving pieces of chalk across the slag to mark where each person stands. Second, Tyron yells that if Sato doesn't move, he'll have to fight alone, and Sato replies, "That's exactly right." Third, the 4th member of the work crew leaves his shift on his own, and his place is taken by a girl from the 2nd crew who asks no questions. Fourth, the 4 of them on the night shift by the cooling furnace. They sit there, and no one says anything out loud. Tyron cuts a loaf of bread into 4 pieces and divides it equally without counting. Sato sat there then and realized that for the first time in 21 years, he didn't need to prove anything to the people around him. He didn't tell anyone this. Later, he regretted not having said it. They tested the new system on the 3rd level 9 days later. It depended on one person. Sato stood in a narrow spot in the gallery and didn't move. Tyron worked with 2 others because of him and fired at the stationary target. The boars charged into the dead end and fell. 14 boars in an hour and 12 minutes. It was the 4th team's best result in 9 years and the Academy's 2nd best result of all time. Tyrene, who was up above, said nothing. He walked over, patted Sato on the shoulder, and left. 6 months later, Sato learned that that very evening, Tyrene had submitted a memo to the instructors proposing that teams be organized under a new system tailored to people with the gift of fortitude, and that the memo had been reviewed and rejected. Sato's name did not appear even once in the note. Tyron had listed the academy in it, but had not included himself. Over the next 2 months, the guild progressed through the 4th and 5th tiers. Sato acquired 2 new properties from them and incorporated both into the equipment rather than the weapons. From the 4th tier, he took the Salt Owl's vision and embedded it in the tip of the pole the guild used to inspect the vaults. From the 5th tier, he took the Blind Mole's sense of the void and embedded it in the probe. Kaina brought these items to the mentors, and the mentors accepted them without question because they worked. No one asked how. Saito then realized something else. A method could be concealed without actually hiding it. People don't ask how something works if it gets the job done. The problem arose on the 61st day. It came in the form of a list. The Academy posted a list in the courtyard of the guilds admitted to the fall review. The review was held once every 3 years. All 6 academies of the tier gathered for it, and the Threshold College appointed the judges. The winning guild earned the right to descend below the 5th tier for the next 3 years. The 4th guild was listed. There was a note next to it. The note stated that the guild was admitted conditionally and that the condition would be lifted after its membership was verified against the registry. Verification of membership against the registry. Sato stood before the list and understood what he was reading. The Academy had removed the ash caste from him. The Academy could not overturn the census record. In the registry, he was still listed as entry 42 under the deceased Toju. Any verification of the guild's membership would run up against that entry. He went to see Kana. Kana read the note and sat down. Then she said that in 100 years, there had been 3 conditional admissions, and all 3 concerned individuals, not guilds. She said the note had been written with a specific person in mind. She asked if he knew who in the college might have done this. He replied that he recognized the signature. He said it was the signature of the scribe Ujen. Kana paused and said that Ujen wouldn't write something like that on his own. She said she would need 2 weeks. That same evening, a man in a gray cloak with a trimmed collar arrived at the academy gates. He did not go inside. He stopped at the gates and asked to speak with the apprentices of the 4th guild. Rinhar was as polite as ever. He said he was glad everything had been resolved. He said he'd been worried all these weeks. He said he was ready to testify on behalf of the guild's members before the college because he had known Sato since childhood. And he named his price without calling it a price. He said he would like to receive a single blade crafted by his old friend. Anyone, one of his friends' choosing. Sato stood at the gate, looking at him, and realized that the man knew everything. About the properties, about the method. He had known this from the very beginning. He had known it that evening when he'd been examining the hammer on his belt at the mouth of the well. Rinhar waited for an answer with a warm, open expression. Sato said the blade would be his. He said he would forge it himself, and he said he would hand it over in person at the review, in the presence of the college judges. Kaina took 2 weeks and finished in 11 days. She returned from the copper tier that evening, sat down by his hearth, and said there were 3 pieces of news, all of them bad. First, line 42 in the census register cannot be contested because the original census sheet for the Copper Ravine for that year is listed as lost during the archive transfer. 1 sheet is missing, that very one. Second, a petition for restoration will only be accepted if there is a living witness who was standing in line next to her and is willing to give testimony on record. Third, the witness turned up on his own. Oben came to the academy 2 days after her return. He walked up from the copper tier because he didn't have enough for the lift. He stood at the gate, crumpling his hat, and Sato didn't recognize him right away because he had lost half his weight in 4 months. Oben said that his daughter was completely healthy. He said that the debt to the office had grown to 900 sparks. He said he was ready to give a recorded statement and tell everything. He said he had been standing in the 37th spot and had seen the clerk Ujen erase 2 lines with a knife, and that a man in a gray cloak had been standing behind the clerk, and that he had made out the man's face and would name him. He spoke all this in one breath without pausing, as if reciting a memorized passage. Then he fell silent and waited. Sato asked what would happen to him afterward. Oben didn't understand the question. Sato repeated it. He asked what would happen to the man who testified against the college's clerk and against Obsidian if he owed 900 sparks to the firm that worked for both of them. Oban replied that he hadn't thought about it. He was lying. He'd been thinking about it for 4 months. Kaina then said one thing, and she said it in an even voice. She said the testimony would be accepted. She said the line would be restored in half a year, and she said that by that time, the man would be gone. She said she'd seen this happen 3 times in 40 years, and that all 3 times the witnesses had died before the record was made, and died legally. The debt was transferred to the circle, and the man didn't come out of the vat. Sato stood there and counted. 6 months. Line 42. Review in 29 days. Rinhar. Ujen. All the pieces converged at a single point, and that point cost the life of a man with a 7-year-old daughter. He refused. He told Oban that the testimony wasn't necessary. He said he'd find another way. Oban burst into tears right at the gate, and it was the worst thing Sato had seen that year. He wasn't crying out of grief. He was crying out of relief, and he was ashamed of that relief. He went down that very evening. Sato gave him 30 sparks for the elevator, and Oban took them. Sato later revisited that decision many times, and each time considered it the right one. He was wrong. The hearing opened on the upper platform of the silver tier, and the entire tier gathered there. 6 academies, 22 guilds, the judge's box of the Threshold College with 4 clerks and the magistrate. Sato saw the magistrate for the first time, a gaunt man of about 70, dressed in black without a single insignia. He sat motionless throughout the first session and never once leaned toward his neighbors. The competition consisted of 3 trials. The first was the equipment test. Each guild presented 3 items of their own making, and the items were tested for tear resistance, bending strength, and impact resistance. The 4th guild presented a probe with the ability to sense voids, a staff with the vision of an owl, and an armor blade. The probe detected a void in the masonry that 5 instructors had failed to find. The rod revealed a crack in the vault 2 steps deep. The blade withstood the blow of a jackhammer and did not crack. First place? No question. The second test was a combat test. The teams faced off against a pair of salt boars brought onto the platform in cages. The 4th team took down both in 1 minute and 40 seconds. Sato stood in a narrow spot and didn't budge once, and the boars fell before him. First place. The stands were already buzzing with excitement. The 3rd trial was the Master's Trial. 1 person from each guild stepped forward and, in the presence of the judges, forged a single item according to the assignment. The assignment was revealed on the spot. It turned out to be an ordinary crutch, a mockery of everyone present. Even a first-year apprentice could forge a crutch. Sato stepped up to the forge and realized what the test was really about. They weren't judging the item. They were judging his skill. He folded the metal 4 times, something no one does for a crutch. He forged a crutch with a hardness of 19 and presented it to the judges. For the first time all day, the magistrate leaned forward. The top 3 places. The 4th Guild of the Anvil Academy swept the competition for the first time in 40 years. Tyron grabbed him by the shoulders on the arena floor, shaking him and shouting something, but Sato couldn't make out the words. Kaina stood at the edge and didn't approach. She wasn't looking at the guild. She was looking at the judge's box. Rinhar approached him immediately after the announcement. He approached in front of the judges and the stands, just as they'd agreed. He said loudly that he was happy for his old friend. He held out his hand for the promised blade. Sato handed him the blade. The blade was of the 3rd tempering with a carcass rating of 19, and it had not a single property. Pure metal. Good work, and nothing more. He held it up in front of the judges so that everyone could see. He said aloud that this was the best he could do with his own hands, and that it was not the blacksmith, but the one who wields it, who imbues an item with its properties. The spectators took this as fine rhetoric. The judges took note. Rinhar took the blade, and his expression did not change one iota. He thanked him warmly. In 2 days, he would discover that the blade was empty. Sato knew he would find out. He did it for one reason. He did it so that the judges' records would show that Obsidian Rinhar had publicly received an item from someone struck from the registry. It was the first thread he tied to that man, and he would tie 11 more over the next 3 years. That evening, the academy was celebrating. Sato left the main courtyard an hour later. He went to the forge and began putting his tools away. He didn't know how to celebrate, and he never learned to do so in his lifetime. Kaina found him there. She walked in and paused in the doorway, and he understood everything from the look on her face before she even opened her mouth. Oban had died on the copper tier 4 days ago. Mazan's office had converted the debt of 900 sparks into labor. The labor assignment was at the water pump in the circle of debt. He went out into the vat on the second evening. He stood there for 11 minutes. He wasn't a fighter. He'd been sharpening files for 19 years. He went into the vat because they paid 132 sparks for 11 minutes, and because he figured he'd pay it all off in 9 evenings. Tegu tried to take him down after the 3rd minute. Oban didn't go down. Saito listened and didn't move. Kaina said the final word. She said that the request for his labor had been submitted through a debt buyout, through the same buyout as the request for Haran. He sat down on the floor by the furnace and stayed there until morning. He analyzed what had happened the way he analyzed everything, piece by piece. Oban didn't go to testify because Saito had forbidden him to, so he wasn't killed for his testimony. So he was killed because he might have testified in the future. So his refusal didn't change anything. So the decision he thought was right was just a 2-month reprieve. And so he wasn't wrong to refuse. He was wrong to leave Oban downstairs instead of taking him upstairs. He could have. He had the academy, he had Kaina, and he had 190 sparks in his pocket. He didn't think about any of that even once. He thought about the line in the registry and about the review. By morning, he had reached rock bottom, and at the bottom lay a single phrase. He repeated it aloud in the empty forge. He said that a person who values everything except people is wrong. After that, he did things he couldn't explain later. He went to the iron warehouse and took a strip of metal. He stoked the forge. He took the black Haran grain out of a rag and placed it on the anvil. Kaina didn't try to talk him out of it, and he later considered this the greatest mark of respect he'd ever received at the academy. She simply said she'd give him 9 days to pack and that she'd take back anything he didn't manage to carry with him. He spent 8 days packing. He described those days in 4 scenes. The first, the iron warehouse, where he sorts through the scrap and selects 14 out of 120 strips. Second, horn, where he folds each strip in 4 and then again, and the frame stops at 20 and won't go any higher no matter how hard he strikes it. Third, the courtyard at night, and he strikes the finished blades with the flat of the hammer, counting the blows until they crack, and piles the cracked ones into a separate heap that by morning turns out to be larger than the intact ones. Fourth, Tyron arrives on the 8th day and silently places his own tools on the anvil. A probe, a rod, 2 clamps. He doesn't ask where or why. He says that on the 6th tier, they'll manage even without the probe. Saito took 11 blades with him, 3 sets of armor, 19 each, 2 splices, 1 rip, 1 hearing, One probe with a sense of emptiness. 3 empty blanks. A brazier. A hammer with a worn-away mark. He left the blade of the gift of the signature at the academy, hidden under the masonry, and kinda didn't know about it. The academy's guild knew the 12th tier of the well only from descriptions and nothing more. He descended for 6 days. He didn't encounter a single person after the 7th tier. He made his way through each level by sound alone and did not linger. He did not collect any grains except those that fell at his feet. By the 11th level, he had 2 whole armor blades left out of 3, and he began to realize he had miscalculated his supplies. The passage to the salt womb was found on the 12th level in the western wall. It was neither a breach nor a cave. It was a door. The threshold, made of compressed salt, was 4 paces high and so smooth that it could not have been natural. There was a single inscription on the threshold, and it had not been carved with a chisel. It had been etched. Sato read it and reread it 3 times. The inscription said that beyond the door, the price was not one's life. The inscription said that the price was whatever a person was capable of. He entered. Inside was a corridor 200 paces long, with a floor of crushed salt and a ceiling as tall as a man. At the end of the corridor, there was a light. He didn't understand where the light was coming from, and he never fully understood it. He took 9 steps and sat down on the floor. He took off his boots. He didn't do it on a whim. He listened to the corridor with the knife of his hearing and heard something beneath the crushed salt that shouldn't have been there. He heard that the salt beneath his feet sounded the same for all 200 steps, and that wasn't how it was supposed to be. So the floor wasn't really a floor. So he had to walk on it the right way. He walked barefoot. The first step was nothing but pain. The crushed salt cut into his skin like glass, and that was to be expected. On the 20th step, he realized that the pain wasn't traveling upward through his foot. It was going off to the side somewhere. On the 40th step, he looked at his hands and saw that the skin on them had become softer. The white specks of scale that had accumulated over 6 years began to fade. By the 60th step, he could no longer remember how to place a grain under the white stripe by feel. He stopped and stood there for a very long time. That was the price. The womb did not take blood. The womb took the craft. Each step erased something from what his hands knew how to do. He sat down right on the crushed salt and began to think. There were another 140 steps to go. He counted how many he knew. He knew 60 heartbeats. He knew how to fold it in 4. He knew how to strike the seam from the bottom up. He knew how to set the grain by feel. He knew how to listen. He knew how to wait. He knew how to stay on his feet. In all, he counted 22 skills and realized that they wouldn't be enough for 140 steps under any circumstances. Then he did the only thing he could think of. He took out one of the empty blanks and began forging it right there on a block of salt, without fire. He struck the cold metal with his hammer, but the strip wouldn't yield, and it was pointless. He wasn't doing it for the strip's sake. He was doing it so that his hand would repeat the motion as he walked. He walked and struck, a step and a blow, a step and a blow. Whatever was worn away, he immediately hammered back into place through the motion. He walked like that for 80 steps, and on the 81st, his hand faltered, and he struck wide, hitting his knee. He crawled the remaining 30. He crawled and struck the strip with the hammer while lying down. By the end of the corridor, he didn't have a single intact fingernail left, and he couldn't remember his name 4 times in a row. Each time, he recalled it through the motion of the hammer. On the last step, he fell out of the corridor into a round cell and lay there for who knows how long. When he was able to sit up, he checked himself. He remembered 60 heartbeats. He remembered the seam running from bottom to top. He remembered how to set the grain blindly. He didn't remember the name of the woman from whom he'd rented a corner on Ash Row. He didn't remember the cart driver's face. He didn't remember the 3 years of his childhood before the workshop. The womb took away not his craft, it took everything else and left the craft behind because the craft he held in his hands. There was an anvil in the cell, just one, without a bellows or coal. It was embedded in the floor and made of a metal Sato didn't recognize. A sign hung above it, and the sign was short. It said that whatever was forged here drew its fire from the blacksmith. He placed the last piece of metal on the anvil and didn't know what to do. He tried striking it. The metal was cold. He struck it 100 times, but the strip wouldn't form. Then he placed his palm on it. The metal drew the warmth from his palm instantly, and his palm turned white. The strip heated up to the width of a finger. He understood. He lay face down on the anvil and covered the strip with his body. He lay there until the strip turned white, and it took a time he didn't count. He couldn't count. By the end, he couldn't feel his chest or stomach at all and was breathing every other breath. He stood up and struck it 12 times. On the 9th strike, he lost consciousness while standing and woke up with the hammer already raised. He had finished forging it. He hadn't quenched it because there was no water. He set it on the floor, sat down next to it, and waited to see what would happen. The line above the bar appeared a minute later. The frame read 43,000. He stared at that number for a very long time. Then he laughed, and the laugh came out so strangely that he startled himself and fell silent. 43,000. 20 had been his limit 9 days ago. Something shifted in the chamber, and he looked up. A second door opened in the wall, revealing a second chamber, and inside, on a stand, lay a hammer. The hammer was identical to the one hanging from his belt. The same heavy head, the same short handle, the same balance shifted a finger's width forward. There was only one difference. There was a brand on the side of the head, and the brand was intact. Sato took his hammer from his belt and placed it next to the other one. The two hammers lay side by side on the stand, one with a worn-away mark and the other with a brand. He read the brand. It wasn't a name. It was a caste symbol. The caste was called the Nameless, and such a caste had not been in the Threshold College's registry for 109 years. He sat there with those two hammers for a very long time. Then he gathered everything he knew in his mind. Toju lived with his own mountain on Ash Row, which was impossible. The mark on his hammer had been worn away from the inside, not chipped off. The Nameless caste was struck from the registry exactly when the well opened. The salt womb takes everything from a person except what they hold in their hands. That means the womb wasn't built to kill. It was built to take away. It took away those from whom only their craft remained. 413 people entered here, and not a single one came out. Not because they were killed. They did not come out because by the end of the corridor, they had nothing left to carry out. He took both hammers. Then he put the new one back. He took his own. He could not explain why, and he never did. He left the womb through the 4th gate, which opened on its own, and emerged not on the 12th level. He emerged onto the surface 3 versts from the academy, in an old open-air salt dump, for the first time in 9 days. He lay on the dump, looked up, and remembered anew what a sky like this was like. Then he sat down and took out the only thing he had brought with him, the strip with the skeleton 43,000. Empty, without any properties. He realized what it was. It was not a weapon. It was something into which one could now plant a human seed, and not just once. He stood up and walked toward the academy, counting as he went. Reinhar Obsidian with the gift of the blade, Ujen, the scribe, Mazan, the tax collector, the commandant of the copper tier who had signed off on the seizure of the notebook, the magistrate of the college, dressed in black without insignia. 5 people, 5 seeds, and now he had a place to put them. He reached the academy gates by evening, and they were locked, which was unusual for that time of day. There were people standing in the courtyard with lanterns, many of them, and they stood in silence. He recognized that silence immediately. He listened to the courtyard with the keenest of ears for 3 minutes and heard 28 people inside, but not a single voice from the academy. He didn't hear Cain. He didn't hear Tyrone. Then he heard masonry being carried out of the forge and someone striking a stone with a chisel right where he had hidden the blade of the gift of signing. He didn't go to the gate. He circled the courtyard along the slag heap and lay down behind a pile of scales 60 paces from the smithy. He held the listening knife in his right palm and didn't move for an hour and a half. He mapped out the courtyard in his mind just as he had mapped out the rift. 28 people, 8 at the gate, 6 in the blacksmith shop, chiseling at the masonry, 4 in the iron warehouse were counting aloud, and he heard them naming the strips by grade. So it was an inventory. So they hadn't come to loot. They'd come to seize the goods according to the paperwork. The remaining 10 stood in a chain across the courtyard and didn't move at all. He heard Kana at the second hour. She was in the accounting room, speaking evenly and concisely. He couldn't make out the words through 2 walls, but he heard the rhythm, and from the rhythm, he understood that she wasn't asking. She was arguing on the merits of the case. So she's alive. So the conversation is about paperwork, not blood. He didn't hear Terran anywhere. The blade of the gift of signature was pulled out of the masonry at the 3rd hour. He heard a piece fall away and one man tell another that they'd found it and how the other ordered them not to touch it with their hands. Sato lay in the slag and realized that this was exactly how he'd lost his first possession. He'd hidden it in the masonry because he considered the masonry his own. The masonry wasn't his. Nothing at the academy belonged to him. He left the dump an hour before dawn and didn't wait for morning. He went down to the old spillway and sat there for a full day, and during that day, he pieced together the whole picture in his mind. He had learned to do this quickly by now. The womb had burned away his names and faces and 3 years of childhood, leaving his head empty, and because of this, his thoughts flowed through it unimpeded. He later called this the only reward that had given him anything. The Academy's selection came on the 2nd day after the review. The Academy took the top 3 places and the right to descend below the 5th tier for 3 years. That right was worth more than the entire Academy. So they were selecting him. They were selecting him through the guild's roster. The guild had been provisionally admitted, subject to verification against the registry, and in the registry, he was listed as number 42. No one had restored that entry, so the 4th guild went to the review with a person who, on paper, did not exist. That means the results of the review can be contested in their entirety. That means the right to descend passes to another academy. And that means the blade of the gift of signature that they pulled out of the masonry wasn't the target of the seizure, but a gift they found there. He counted what he had. 11 blades, of which 6 remained intact. A hammer, a brazier, a strip with a skeleton, 43,000. And not a single place on all 7 tiers where he could have entered as a human. He went down into the salt rift. He walked there for 4 days, and on the 4th day, on the upper walkway, an old man from the lift met him. The old man was standing there as if he'd been waiting for that very hour. He said that the change had come. He said that 41 people had died in the pit over the past 5 months, and that 30 of them would have died anyway. He said that 11 would not have died if the blacksmith had been there. Sato replied that he had not returned to heal. The old man said he knew that, and that the change was not about that. The change was about something else. Over those 5 months, the rift had changed. Weiron died at the beginning of winter of old age emphysema, and his nephew, Daisan, took over the water supply. Daison raised the quota from 3 sparks to 5. Half of the 6th level stopped paying, and half of the 6th level began to die. And then those who remembered the healing blacksmith did not go to Daison. They went to the lower horizon and began hunting the Stitchers themselves. They didn't know how to kill them. They only knew how to drive them away. Over the winter on the lower horizon, 9 people died. They gathered 22 grains and stored them in rags, just as one stores bread. The old man said that the exchange was like this. He said that the pit gives 22 grains and asks for 1. It asks that the blacksmith make water unnecessary. Sato asked how. The old man replied that it was up to the blacksmith to decide, and that they had been waiting 5 months for him to do just that. He took the 22 grains and went to the tunnel on the 4th level, where he worked for 19 days. He later described these days in 4 scenes. The first. He descends to the lower horizon with 2 men from the rift and teaches them to strike the knot from below. The first of them breaks his arm, while the second gets it right on the 4th try. Second. He stands by a dry riverbed on the 5th level with a probe for sensing emptiness in his hand and walks along the wall for 8 hours straight. Third. The men strike the rock at the spot where he placed a chalk cross and strike for 3 days without stopping, working in shifts of 4. Fourth. Water flows. It doesn't flow in a stream. It flows as a wet patch down the wall and forms a puddle 2 spans wide within a day. That was enough for 40 people. It wasn't a victory. It was the first milestone. After that, he marked 6 more spots with crosses, and water was found at 4 of them. Within 19 days, the fault had ceased to be a pit with just 1 hoist. Daison came to see him on the 20th day, arriving alone without his men. He sat down on a log and remained silent for a long time. Then he said that the blacksmith had ruined him in 3 weeks. Sato replied that he hadn't touched the hoist. Daison said it wasn't about the hoist. He said that his uncle had maintained the pit for 20 years because there was only 1 drain and it was in 1 place. He said that now there were 7 drains, all in different places, and that there was no one to maintain it. He asked what the blacksmith planned to do with the pit next. Sato replied that he wouldn't do anything. He said he would leave in a day. Daison looked at him and said he didn't understand. He said that a man who could take over the pit but didn't was either a fool or a very busy man. Sato replied that it was the latter. He was the first skeptic of the rift, and he left not convinced, but puzzled. Sato later learned that Daison hadn't raised the bar even once in the years that followed, and not because he'd become kind. He'd simply stopped seeing the point in it. That night, a man from the copper tier came to the tunnel. He descended into the rift on his own, without anyone guiding him, which meant he knew the way. He was wearing dry clothes and stood upright, and Sato recognized him within 3 heartbeats by the way he held his head. Titan. He was alive. He was alive, and he wasn't working at the academy. He said this in his very first sentence. He said that the 4th Artel's academy no longer existed. He spoke for an hour, and Sato didn't interrupt him even once. After the seizure, the review was re-examined. The result was annulled on procedural grounds. The right to descend below the 5th tier was transferred to the 2nd tier academy, and the 2nd tier academy was bound by Maison's debt redemption through 3 sureties. Kainu was removed from his mentoring position and transferred to the archives. The 4th guild was disbanded. Tyron filed a petition to reinstate the result, and the petition was rejected the same day without consideration. Then he left of his own accord. He said he didn't leave out of nobility. He said that for 9 years he had been building a place for himself, and that place turned out to be someone else's, and that he realized this in a single evening. Then he said what he had come down for. The blade of the gift, bearing the Collegium seal, had not been transferred to the archives. It had been taken to the copper tier, to Maison's office. 11 days later, a census of ranks was conducted on the copper tier. Not a census of people, a census of lines. 260 entries in the register were rearranged in a single night. 40 people woke up in castes lower than the ones they had held. 6 woke up in higher ones. Everything was signed with the signature of the threshold collegium, and the signature was genuine. Sato sat and listened, realizing what he himself had done. He had forged an object. The thing was taken, and it worked in the hands of others exactly as it was meant to. Framework 3. 3 uses. 1 was used for 260 entries. That means 2 remain. Terran said the last thing. He said that among the 40 who had been demoted was the name of Hassan, the master of the foundry on the copper tier, 62 years old, transferred to the ash caste with an inherited debt of 4,000 sparks. Sato stood up, left the tunnel, and stood outside above the crack for a very long time. Hassan didn't say a single word that first morning. Hassan hung his scorched glove on a nail and didn't speak up. Sato remembered that gesture better than he remembered the faces of his parents, whom the womb had taken from him entirely. He returned and told Tyron one thing. He said he was going up. Tyron asked where exactly. Sato replied that he was going for grain. Tyron didn't understand and asked again. Sato explained everything to him that night. He explained the properties, and about the skeleton, and about how the grain falls out of a dead person, and about the 43,000-strong band with the skeleton that awaits its grain. He spoke calmly and never once made excuses. Tyron listened, and his expression changed. Sato watched that face and saw the man deciding whether to stay or leave. Tyron listened until the very end. Then he asked one thing. He asked how many people Sato intended to kill. Sato replied that he didn't know. Tyron said that was the wrong answer. He said that a man who doesn't know the number will kill everyone within his reach. He said he would name the number himself if the blacksmith couldn't. He said the number was 1. He said that if 1 were enough, the rest would fall on their own because the masonry rests on the top stone, not the ones below. Sato sat in silence. Then he said that the top stone was the magistrate of the Threshold College and that he didn't even know his name. Tyron replied that he would find out the name in 9 days. He said that to do so, he needed to return to the academy and lie back down in the archives under Kana's arm. He said that the archive was the only place where all the papers were kept together in one place. He went upstairs in the morning. Sato stayed in the rift and worked for another 12 days. He was forging one thing, and that thing was not a weapon. He was forging a sheath for the Carcass 43,000 strip. 3 people sat in a tunnel on the 4th level of the fault, putting together a plan. Sato later said that this was the only true collaborative effort of his life, and that he had only one regret. He regretted that he hadn't said a single kind word to them that evening. Kana laid out the Collegium's apparatus piece by piece, just as one would lay out fishing tackle. The Threshold College stood on the silver tier and occupied 4 buildings: the Registry House, the Accounting House, the House of Scales, where the Threshold Scales themselves were kept and where the census was conducted once a year, and the Archive. The Archive was not a building, but a lower level beneath all 4, extending 3 stories deep into the rock. The boxes were organized by year. The box containing the records of the copper tier for the relevant year was kept on the 2nd floor, under the magistrate's inventory. There were 3 ways it could not be accessed. Entry was permitted only after signing the visitor's log. It was impossible to remove the documents because there was a security checkpoint at the exit. And the power of signature didn't work here either, because the magistrate's inventory was authenticated not by a signature, but by a personal fingerprint, and Odin had that fingerprint on his finger. Tyron laid out the second part. The inspection was cancelled, and the right to descend went to the second academy. The second academy was scheduled to reach the sixth tier in 22 days. All of the silver tier's attention would be focused there. On the day of the descent, the collegium assigns judges, and half the scribes go to the site. Kana said that this wouldn't accomplish anything. She said that it isn't the scribes who go to the archives, but the archivists. There are 4 of them, and they don't attend the descents. Then, Sato asked a question that turned the whole conversation on its head. He didn't ask how to get into the archives. He asked who had last touched the box. Kana replied that the inventory list had a date on it and that the box had been opened 11 years ago. He asked who had opened it. She said the entry had been erasured, not crossed out. He sat staring into the fire, lost in thought. 11 years ago. Toju died 3 weeks before his census. Toju lived with his own forge on Ash Row, which is impossible. Toju's hammer, with the mark of the nameless caste erased from the inside. Records are erased in only one way. He asked Kane how many years ago Hassan had been left to rot in someone else's furnace. She replied, 40. He asked if she remembered whether Hassan had a brand. She said that Hassan had never had a brand, and that she had always found that strange for a master of his caliber. He stood up and left the tunnel. He was gone for 4 hours. He returned and said he was going up today and wouldn't be going to the archives. He was going to the copper tier to look for Hassan. He hadn't seen the copper tier in 7 months. He entered it at night under a stranger's guise, one he didn't possess, and so simply wore a hood and kept his head down. The foundry was still standing, and in the courtyard only 1 brazier was burning instead of 3. Hassan wasn't in the foundry. At the water tap, he was told that the old foreman now lived in the lower shed on Ash Row, and that he didn't have long to live. Sato found the shed by morning. It was the very same shed where Toju had died. He realized this from its location and wasn't surprised at all. Hassan was lying on the straw and was conscious. He looked at the man who had entered, recognized him immediately, and showed neither joy nor fear. He said he had been waiting. He went on speaking for 2 hours, and it was more than he had said to Sato in 6 years of apprenticeship. The nameless caste was not a caste. It was a class of masters who stamped the scales of the threshold. The scales were not made at the college. They were forged. Every threshold scale on every tier was forged by human hands, and that person authenticated them with their own mark. The mark of the scale master was the imprint that was then used to authenticate every census sheet. 109 years ago, the well opened, and the Threshold College took full control of the census. The masters of the scales turned out to be the only people outside the college who could apply the authentic stamp. They were struck from the register 8 years ago. They weren't killed. They were struck from the register. Their marks were erased from their hammers, and they were registered as guild blacksmiths. Those who refused were registered at a lower level. Hassan said he was the last apprentice of the last master of the scales, and that he hadn't been branded because there was no one left to do it. He said that Toju had been his apprentice before Sato, and that Toju had tried. 11 years ago, Toju entered the college's archives using a forged record, opened a drawer, and got his hands on the documents. He was caught on his way out. He wasn't put on trial. He was reassigned to the Ash caste and allowed to live as a warning to others. He lived for 10 years in a shed and died. Sato asked why Hassan had remained silent that morning in the courtyard. Hassan replied that he had been silent for 40 years and that this was the only thing he had truly learned. Then he said his final words. He said that a hammer with an erased brand was not an heirloom. It was a blank. He said that the brand is erased from within and restored from within, and that this requires metal that can withstand more than 20,000. He said that such metal had not been forged for 109 years, and that he would die without ever knowing how it was made. Sato took a strip of paper from its sheath and laid it on the straw beside him. Hesun looked at the line above it and remained silent for a very long time. Then he began to cry, weeping silently, and Sato sat beside him, leaving him be. Hesun died 2 days later. He managed to tell everything he remembered about the brand and how it was applied, and Sato wrote it down with charcoal on a board because there was no paper. He took the board with him. The grain did not fall out of Hesun. Sato waited for it and hated himself for that waiting, but the grain did not fall out. He understood why only a year later. The gift wasn't in Hesun. The gift was in the brand, and Hesun didn't have a brand. He returned to the rift on the 9th day and found a change there. The rift was empty on the 4th level. Kaina met him at the bridge and said that 3 days earlier, people from Mazan's office had gone down into the pit and that they weren't looking for a blacksmith. They had brought a document. According to the document, the salt rift was being re-entered into the Threshold College's registry of tiers for the first time in 4 generations. It was being entered along with its entire population. 8,000 people who hadn't existed for 100 years were being assigned castes based on a census scheduled for 30 days later. The document bore the Threshold College's signature. A genuine one. The second of 3 applications. Sato stood on the walkway, looking down at the 7 levels, and understood the situation. This wasn't a blow aimed at him. It was an offer to 8,000 people. The people of the Rift had lived for 100 years without caste or rights, and now they were being offered a place in the system. Half the pit was in favor. He heard this on the very first evening. People said that the blacksmith was certainly a good man, but that a caste was a caste, and that the children would be registered. He couldn't argue with them, and he didn't. He realized then what the order he was about to break really was. That system kept these people afloat. It was blind and cruel, and it had crushed Toja, Hassan, and Oban. Yet it was also what gave the file grinder's 7-year-old daughter the right to water, to the workshop, and to an entry in the register. To break it entirely meant throwing 8,000 people back into the pit. He sat in the tunnel all night mulling this over and found no answer. He found only one thing. He realized that the question wasn't framed correctly. The question wasn't whether to break it or not. The question was, who held the imprint? Tyron arrived at dawn and said that the false census was scheduled for the 30th day and that the scales of the threshold would be brought down from above for it. He said the scales would not be brought from the House of Scales. They would be brought from the archive where the spare set was kept, and the magistrate himself would transport them because only he could apply the imprint. Sato stood up. He said that now he understood why he needed the sheath. He said that 29 days was exactly how long it would take to forge the item. Kaina asked what it was. He replied that it was a brand. For 29 days, he forged the brand, and he forged it differently than he had forged anything before. Hassan hadn't left him a blueprint on the board. He'd left instructions, and the sequence of steps was strange. Master Libra's brand wasn't carved on the head of the hammer. It emerged from within the metal and rose to the surface on its own when the metal was ready to accept it. Hassan called this bringing it out. He said that the master does not apply the brand. The master brings the metal to a state where the brand becomes visible within it. Sato did not understand this for the first 11 days. He described them in 4 scenes. First, he heats a strip with the skeleton 43,000. and it doesn't absorb any heat at all and lies cold in the furnace for 6 hours. Second, he recalls the anvil in the womb and lies face down on the strip, lying on it in his own forge like a fool while the people of the rift peer into the tunnel and leave in silence. Third, he gathers 22 binder grains from all over the pit and forges them into 4 fusion blades to keep his body alive, because every attempt to heat the strip with his own body costs him a day. Fourth, Tyron arrives on the 9th day and says that the blacksmith has aged 10 years in a week, and that if he doesn't stop, in a month there will be no one left to apply the brand. On the 12th day, he understood. He realized he was using the wrong kind of fire. The anvil in the womb drew on the body's heat. The strip drew on something else. He remembered the corridor, 200 steps that erased his skills. He remembered that the strip had been forged on the anvil immediately after the corridor had taken half his memory. The metal didn't draw warmth. The metal drew what a person held within. He took the blade of fusion, placed his palm on the strip, and began to recall deliberately. He recalled 60 heartbeats. The strip grew warm. He recalled how to place the grain blindly. The strip turned red. He held everything he knew in his mind and gave it away one by one, and the strip slowly turned white, and he lost skill after skill as it warmed. By the end of the first day, he couldn't remember how to fold metal in 4. By the end of the 3rd, he couldn't remember the bottom to top seam. By the end of the 5th, he was holding the hammer and wasn't sure he was using it correctly. He was forging at random, with hands that still remembered the movements, even though his mind no longer did. Kaina sat in the tunnel all those days and wrote down whatever he said aloud. Every morning she made him repeat aloud what he could do, and she wrote down a list, and the list grew shorter. On the 17th day, there were 4 items left on the list. He knew how to listen. He knew how to wait. He knew how not to lie down. And he knew how to strike with a hammer from top to bottom. On the 21st day, a brand appeared on the side of the head. It emerged on its own, just as a pattern appears on cooling glass. Sato looked at it and didn't understand what he was seeing. Kaina brought him the college's inventory sheet she'd retrieved from the archives and held it up next to it. The imprint matched. Not in design, in very essence. It was the same mark that had appeared on every census sheet across all tiers for 109 years. The imprint of the threshold scales and the master's brand were one and the same, and always had been. The college hadn't forged it. The college had simply taken the last one and passed it from hand to hand for 41 years. Sato took the finished brand in his hand. The line above it was short. Frame, 43,000. No properties. He sat down on the floor and said aloud that the object was empty. Kaina replied that the item wasn't empty. She said he'd been thinking about the wrong thing all this time. She said that properties aren't imbued into the brand. The brand itself is the property because it is the only thing a person can rely on in this world. There were 8 days left. He spent them regaining the use of his hands. He forged the simplest items 10 times in a row. Staples, crutches, hinges. He did the same thing he'd done in the womb's corridor. He hammered the skill back in through movement. Kaina read her list aloud to him, and he repeated after her. By the 27th day, he remembered 60 heartbeats. By the 28th, he had recalled the seam from bottom to top. He never managed to remember how to fold it in 4, and for the rest of his life, he asked others to do it for him. The Rift census was scheduled for the 30th day at the upper bridge. The council had built a wooden platform there in a week. 8,000 people were to pass through one by one. The threshold scales had been brought the night before on a cart covered with a canvas. and Sato watched them from the 6th level through a crack between the stones. It was a bowl on a tripod 2 human heights tall, and it was forged in such a way that he stared at it for 40 minutes and could not take his eyes off it. Whoever made it knew everything there was to know about metal. Magistrate Odin arrived in the morning. He stepped down from the cart on his own without assistance, stood by the platform, and remained standing all day. He was 73 years old. He was lean and upright, dressed in black without a single insignia. Sato watched him from the crowd, waiting to see what he would feel. He felt nothing. He had expected hatred, but it wasn't there. He looked at the man who had held the imprint in his finger for 41 years and realized that this man had done nothing to him personally. Rinhar arrived in the second cart, accompanied by his entourage. In 7 months, he had risen through the ranks. He no longer wore a gray cloak, but one in black with silver trim, and he was now called the Commissioner for Tiered Supervision. He stood to the magistrate's right all day. The census had been underway since dawn. The people of the rift climbed onto the platform one by one, stepped onto the weighing pan, and as the pan descended, the scribe wrote a line. The magistrate placed a fingerprint on the sheet once every 100 people. He did so with his finger. Sato stood in line, waiting for his turn and listening. He heard everything he needed to hear. He heard Rinhar whisper to the scribe the entries that needed to be under-reported, naming them one by one. He heard 8 names, and among them was the name of the old man from the lift and the name of the woman who had straightened up. He heard the scribe confirm that it had been recorded. He approached the platform as the 412th person. He climbed up, stood on the platform, and removed his hood. Magistrate Odin looked at him without interest. Rinhar looked at him, and his expression did not change at all, and that was the most honest thing Sato had ever seen in him. The pan beneath his feet began to descend, stopping neither at the first mark nor at the second. It continued downward until it came to rest on the stop. The scribe leaned toward the scale, straightened up, and looked at the magistrate. He said that the reading was off the scale. It grew silent within a radius of 400 paces. Magistrate Odin approached the bowl himself. He looked at the stopper, then at Sato, and spoke for the first time that day. He asked his name. Sato gave his name. The magistrate said that this name appeared in the copper tier registry on line 42, and that the person listed under that line was recorded as a debtor and had been struck from the rolls of the Anvil Academy. He said this matter-of-factly, without accusation. He was simply reading aloud what he remembered. He knew his line by heart. It was then that Sato understood the most important thing about this man. Odin was neither a villain nor greedy. He was a man who had kept the entire register in his head for 41 years and believed that the register was the world itself. Then Sato did what he had come to do. He drew the hammer with the engraved brand from its sheath and raised it so that the platform could see it. He didn't say a word. The magistrate looked at the brand and took half a step back. It was the only movement he had made all day that was not of his own volition. Reinhard stepped forward, placed his hand on the blade, and announced loudly that the man was armed and was about to attack the magistrate. He said this to give the order to the guards. The guards moved toward the platform, and then Sato spoke his first sentence, saying it loud enough for 8,000 people to hear. He said he had no intention of killing anyone. He said he had come to affix his seal to his own sheet. He said he had the right to do so by virtue of his rank as a master of the scales of the threshold. And he placed the hammer, seal side down, on the unsigned sheet of the Rift census. The fingerprint was clear. It appeared on the paper just as clearly as the magistrate's fingerprint had, and no one could tell the difference. The clerk leaned over the sheet and stared at it for about 10 seconds. Then he raised his head and said into the silence that the fingerprint was genuine. He said it before he even realized what he was saying. He said it because he had been verifying fingerprints for 19 years, and his hand had reacted faster than his mind. Then the square erupted. 8,000 people had been standing in line since dawn, and they all saw the same thing. The blacksmith from the lower level had placed the same seal on the census sheet as the man in black. The guard stopped halfway to the platform because the senior guard had not received an order. The magistrate was supposed to give the order. The magistrate remained silent. Reinhard gave the order himself, calling it out loudly, and the guards took 3 steps forward before stopping again because the captain looked at the magistrate and saw his raised hand. Odin raised his hand, and the guards stood at attention. He walked over to the sheet and took it in his hands. He held it for a long time. Then he asked Sato one thing, speaking quietly. He asked who had taught him. Sato named 2 people, Hesan and Toju. Magistrate Odin closed his eyes for the duration of 2 heartbeats. He said he remembered both of them. He said he had personally signed the translations of both. He said this without remorse and without pride, and Sato realized that the man was simply reciting lines from his own mind aloud. Then he asked the magistrate the question for which he had traveled here over the course of 8 months. He asked why. Odin answered honestly and at length, and it was the only long answer of the entire day. He said that 109 years ago the well had opened, and the world had ceased to sustain itself. He said that before the well, a person was defined by their craft, their guild, and their lineage, and that had been enough. He said that the well had begun to bestow power upon people without any order, and that the very first generation had flooded the tiers with blood. He said that caste was not an insult. A caste is a person's place in the order, and a person who has a place does not take up a knife. He said that the masters of Libra were good people, and that they were struck from the register not for villainy. They were struck from the register because there must be only one imprint. He said that if there are 2 imprints, the register ceases to be a register, and the world returns to the way it was. He said he had maintained a single imprint for 41 years, and during those 41 years, there had not been a single massacre on the tiers. He said he was ready to answer for every line he had rearranged, and that he had rearranged 412 of them over the course of 41 years. He named the number without hesitation. Sato stood there listening and realized that this man was telling the truth, and that his truth was more terrifying than any lie. He asked about the 260 lines rewritten in a single night on the copper tier without a signature. The magistrate replied that he had not issued such an order. He said this and turned his head to the right. He turned it slowly, the way one turns when one already knows the answer and is checking oneself. Rinhar stood to his right, his face warm and open. He said that this was the first he'd heard of such an order. He said that the transcription of the lines had been carried out by Mason's office at the request of the tier supervisor, and that the request had been signed by the magistrate. He said this calmly, and that was a mistake. He named the document that, in the presence of 8,000 witnesses, could now be demanded. Kaina stepped out of the crowd by the platform and raised her hand. She was wearing an archival gray jacket, and all the clerks of the Collegium recognized her face. She said loudly that, as an archivist of the Second Horizon, she demanded to see the tiered oversight's recommendation signed by the magistrate. She said there had been 9 such recommendations that year. She said that she had held all 9 in her hands 2 weeks ago, and that none of them bore a seal. There was only a signature. It grew very quiet. Magistrate Odin held a sheet from the Rift census in his hands and was not looking at Reinhard. He was looking at his own finger. At that moment, he understood what he had failed to understand for 41 years. The Threshold College's gift of signature had signed the documents. It had not affixed a seal. So all those years, while he believed that order depended on him, order had depended on him only in those documents bearing the seal. In all the others, others had signed on his behalf. He asked Reinhard how many documents the latter had signed in his name. Reinhard didn't answer. He did the only thing left for him to do. He drew his blade and charged at Sato. The gift of the blade, obsidian. He crossed the platform in a single heartbeat, and Sato wouldn't have had time to draw a single blade from his belt. But he didn't. He took half a step to the left. He heard the movement before it even began, because the knife of hearing had hung from his belt for 8 months, and he had never taken it off. Reinhard's blade passed a finger's breadth from his neck and entered the bowl of the scales of the threshold. The metal of the scales absorbed the blow and did not crack. Reinhard yanked the blade back, but it remained lodged in the bowl. Sato struck him once with the branded hammer, from bottom to top in the ribs, just as he had been beating the salt crawlers for 8 months straight. Reinhard fell onto the platform and did not get up. He died a minute later, and he died in silence. A grain rolled out from beneath him. It was dark blue and lay on the planks of the platform in full view of 8,000 people. Sato stood over him and did not bend down for a very long time. He thought about the strip in the scabbard on his back with the carcass of 43,000. He thought, this is it. Obsidian's blade gift embedded in the metal that holds 43,000. He thought of Tyrene, who had said that a man who does not know the number will kill everyone he can reach. He bent down, picked up the grain, put it in his pocket, and did not sheathe it anywhere, neither that day nor afterward. He carried it with him for 11 years and never embedded it. He later explained this with a single sentence. He said he'd taken it so that no one else would pick it up. Magistrate Odin watched all this without moving. Then he did something no one expected of him. He removed the imprint from his finger. The imprint wasn't a ring. It was a flat plate implanted in the pad of his finger, and he removed it himself with a knife, doing so calmly. He placed the plate on the census sheet next to Sato's fingerprint. He said that 2 fingerprints on a single sheet meant that the registry had ceased to exist today. He said this matter-of-factly, and then added that he didn't know what would happen next, and that, for the first time in 41 years, he didn't know. Then he sat down on the edge of the platform and waited. What followed was what Sato later called the hardest day of his life. 8,000 people stood waiting for him to speak. He climbed onto the platform and didn't know what to say. He knew how to listen and wait, and not to lie down and strike with a hammer from top to bottom. He didn't know how to speak to 8,000 people. So he did the only thing he could think of. He took the census sheet and began reading it aloud from the beginning. He read the names. 411 names of those who had come before him. He read for 2 hours. He finished reading and said that the census was continuing, that it would go on until the very last person, and that the mark on the sheet would remain. The people moved on to the next bowl. The Rift census was completed by nightfall the following day. He was walking to the meeting alone. Tyrone had offered to walk with him, and so had Cain, but he turned them both down. He explained it simply. He said that if he arrived with others, the council would speak to a group, but if he arrived alone, the council would speak to a person. He had climbed to the silver tier the day before and spent the night on a rock by the gates of the house of Libra, because he wasn't allowed into the reception courtyard without a pass. In the morning, they let him inside. The meeting hall of the Threshold College was circular and windowless, illuminated by 18 bowls mounted along the wall. 22 people were seated there: scribes, concession holders with guarantees, the 3 heads of the academies, the commandant of the copper tier, and Mazin. Magistrate Odin was absent, and no one sat in his place. The chair stood empty and had not been removed.
The session lasted 6 hours, and Sato later analyzed it piece by piece, just as he had analyzed that first morning in the foundry courtyard. They began with the legality of the matter. The senior scribe read aloud that the rank of Master of the Scales of the Threshold had been struck from the register 109 years ago by a decision of the Collegium, and that a struck from the register rank could not affix a seal. Kaina, who had been summoned as the archivist, replied that the decision to strike the rank from the register was itself certified by Master Vessi's seal, because no other seal existed at that time. She said that the Collegium had struck the rank from the register using his own seal, and that if the rank was invalid, then the decision to strike it from the register was also invalid. The hall was silent for 40 heartbeats. What followed was worse. Mazin stood up and said he wasn't contesting the seal. He said he was contesting the man. He read aloud line 42. Debtor, past due, 8 months of evasion. He said that the debt of 6,400 sparks was listed as outstanding because the Academy had recorded it, but the Academy had been disbanded and the entry had been annulled along with the review. He said that a person with an outstanding debt could not hold any rank. On paper, he was entirely correct. Sato listened and calculated and realized that this was what was holding him back. Then he did what he had been preparing for 4 days. He placed 2 items on the table. First, he placed a hammer with a brand. Second, he placed a sheet of paper. The sheet was an inventory consisting of 412 entries reordered by Magistrate Odin over 41 years, 260 entries transcribed without a signature, and 9 submissions from the Tiered Oversight Committee. Kaina had compiled it from the archives in 11 days. Sato spoke a single sentence. He said he was ready to settle the debt today. He said he would settle it by returning 412 lines and 260 lines to the registry, and that each of these lines represented a person who paid Mazin's office at an underrated caste level. He said that the total amount these people had underpaid over 41 years was so large that he would not name the figure out of respect for those present. Mazin sat down. He didn't sit down because he was afraid of being exposed. He sat down because he'd done the math. Restoring 672 entries meant recalculating 41 years' worth of debts on both sides, and that would bankrupt the concession faster than any court could. They talked for another 5 hours, and by then, they weren't talking about him anymore. They were talking about what to do. Sato sat and listened as 22 people searched for a way out and found none. And he realized that his own task was resolved, and that now someone else's was beginning. By 6 o'clock, the Collegium had arrived at the only solution that satisfied them. They offered him a position, not a demotion, a seat. Magistrate of the Threshold Council. The chair stood empty, and they offered him the seat. The terms were as follows. There would be only one imprint, and it would remain with him. His debt would be written off. Line 42 would be restored according to the original record. 672 lines would be reviewed at his discretion and on his schedule. The Anvil Academy would be reinstated, and the review would be returned. Kane would regain his mentorship. He was 22 years old. He sat in a windowless circular hall, and 8 months of his life converged into a single point, and that point was the chair. He asked for a night. They gave him a night. He did not sleep through it. He left the college building and sat down on the same stone by the gate where he had spent the night before, and he sat there until dawn, counting. He counted everything he could remember. The womb had taken half his memory, and he did not remember his parents' faces,
or the first 3 years of his childhood, nor did he remember the name of the widow who had brought him a bowl of boiled porridge. He remembered 412 lines from the inventory by heart because he had read them 11 times. He remembered how Hassan hung the scorched mitten on a nail and did not intervene. He remembered how Oban wept with relief at the academy gates, and how, 2 months later, he stood in the vat for 11 minutes and did not lie down. He remembered how Magistrate Odin said that in 41 years he had never seen people go to the bowl without fear. And by dawn, he understood one thing, and that thing was simpler than anything he had thought in 8 months. Odin was an honest man. Odin had held the imprint for 41 years without stealing a single spark, and he believed in what he was doing. And Odin signed Hassan's translation and Toju's translation. He didn't remember their faces, but only the lines. The chair had been doing this to a man for 41 years. It hadn't been doing this to an evil man. It had been doing this to an honest one. Saito calculated how old he would be in 41 years and came up with 63. He calculated how many lines he would rearrange during that time, driven by the best of intentions. He couldn't name a number, and that was precisely what made up his mind. He entered the hall in the morning and said he was refusing. He said this as his first sentence and didn't explain right away. His second statement was that he was proposing his own terms. He proposed 3 things. First, the imprint shall not remain alone. The rank of Master of the Scales of the Threshold shall be restored. Apprentices shall be recruited into it, and he himself would undertake to teach them. He said that there must be no fewer than 9 Masters of the Scales across the 7 tiers, and that none of them should sit on the council. Second, the original census records are removed from the college's archives and stored openly in the houses of Libra on each tier, and anyone has the right to view their own entry free of charge on any day. He said that viewing it had cost him 4 sparks, and that he had paid for those 4 sparks with 8 months of his life. Third, he said that he would not review anything himself. 672 entries will be reviewed by 9 Masters of the Scales when they arrive, and they will review them according to the scale's readings, not at anyone's discretion. The college debated for another 4 hours. They accepted everything. They accepted it not because they agreed. They accepted it because the man who refused the chair was more terrifying to them than the man who sat in it. The one who had taken the seat could be counted on. There was nothing to count on with the one who had refused. He left the hall toward evening and walked out through the same courtyard he had entered. Kaina was standing by the gate. She asked if he understood what he had just given up. He replied that he did. He said he had given up the opportunity to restore Hassana's name personally. He said that now his name would be restored in 2 years by 9 people according to the scale's testimony, and that this would be the right thing to do, though it would never make him feel any better. Years passed, and he spoke briefly about them. His rank as a Master of the Scales was restored after 7 months. He took on 4 first students, 3 of whom were from the Salt Rift. Tyron returned to the Anvil Academy, and 3 years later, he was managing the guild there. The program for people with the gift of fortitude was adopted by all 6 academies of the tier. Kane was reinstated as a mentor and worked for another 11 years before dying in her forge while standing at the furnace. Mason's office did not survive the reevaluation and broke up into 4 small concessions 2 years later. Magistrate Odin lived for 4 years after his retirement in a house on the copper tier, and Saito visited him 11 times. They talked about metal, but never once about the registry. Line 42 was restored to the original sheet 2 years and 3 months later, when 9 Masters of the Scales reached the copper tier. He did not go to see it. He asked for a copy to be sent to him, and a copy was sent. He put it in a drawer and never took it out again. He didn't pass on the method to anyone, and not because he was hiding it. He explained it this way. He said that it is not the hand that imbues the metal with its properties, but rather what a person gives of themselves in that moment, and that this cannot be taught, it only be lived. Over the course of 9 years, 4 of his apprentices each developed their own brand, each in their own way, and none of those paths resembled his. He continued to forge weapons imbued with properties for another 11 years, crafting 260 blades during that time. He kept track of them in a notebook, writing the name of the recipient next to each one. He didn't sell a single one. He carried the Rinhar grain in his pocket for 11 years, and in the final year, handed it over to be remelted without a second glance. He kept the hammer with the erased mark for himself and did not restamp it. He kept it as a blank, and when asked, replied that a blank was the most honest thing in the forge because it had not yet declared anything about itself. He died at the age of 68 on the copper tier in the same foundry where he had arrived as a boy, and he died standing by the furnace like Cain. By that time, 34 masters of the scales were working across the 7 tiers, and the imprint had not belonged to a single person for 40 years. Viewing one's own line was free on all tiers, and there was a separate line in the code regarding this, a line that even the children knew by heart. In the foundry, a board remained after his death with rules written in charcoal. There were 19 rules on it. He added the last one a year before his death, and it had nothing to do with blacksmith. He wrote that a person who counts everything except people counts incorrectly. The apprentices took the board down from the wall and hung it in the House of Libra on the copper tier, where it still hangs to this day.